The erratic course the galactic cruiser was traveling was intentional, the product of a desperate desire to avoid the long streaks of intense energy that slid close past its hull. One of those probing beams succeeded in touching the fleeing ship, striking its principal solar fin. Gem-like fragments of metal and plastic erupted into space as the fin disintegrated. The vessel seemed to shudder. The source of those energy beams suddenly hove into view, a lumbering Imperial cruiser, its massive outline bristling with dozens of weapons emplacements. Light ceased arching from those spines now as the cruiser moved in close. Another distant explosion shook the ship, but it certainly didn't feel distant to R2-D2 or C-3PO. The concussion bounced them around the corridor like bearings in an old motor. One would have supposed that the tall, human-like machine, 3PO, was the master, and the stubby, tripodal robot, R2-D2, an inferior. But while 3PO might have sniffed disdainfully at the suggestion, they were in fact equal in everything save loquacity. Here, 3PO was clearly the superior. Still another explosion rattled the corridor, throwing 3PO off balance. R2 glanced up at 3PO, who was steadying himself against a corridor wall. Lights blinked enigmatically around a single mechanical eye as the smaller robot studied the battered casing of his friend. Accompanying the last attack was a persistent deep hum, which even the loudest explosion had not been able to drown out. Then, for no apparent reason, the basso thrumming abruptly ceased.
"Did you hear that?"
3PO inquired rhetorically of his patient companion.
"They've shut down the main reactor. This is madness."
He shook his head slowly.
"This time we'll be destroyed for sure. We can't enter the atmosphere with our main stabilizer fin destroyed. I can't believe we're simply going to surrender."
A small band of armed humans suddenly appeared, rifles held at the ready. They carried about them the aura of men prepared to die. 3PO watched silently until they had vanished around a far bend in the passageway. When several muffled explosions sounded, 3PO murmured,
"They've broken in somewhere above us. There's no escape for the captain this time."
Turning, he peered down at R2.
"I think we'd better—"
The shriek of overstressed metal filled the air before he could finish, and the far end of the passageway was lit by a blinding flash. Somewhere down there, the little cluster of armed crew who had passed by minutes before had encountered the ship's attackers. At the far end, a gaping hole appeared in the roof, and reflective forms like big metal beads began dropping to the corridor floor. Both robots knew that no machine could match the fluidity of those shapes. The new arrivals were humans in armor. One of them looked past 3PO. The figure shifted its big rifle around in armored hands. Too late. A beam of intense light struck the head, sending pieces of armor, bone, and flesh flying in all directions. Half the invading Imperial troops turned and began returning fire up the corridor, aiming past the two robots.
"Quick, this way,"
3PO ordered. R2 turned with him. They had taken only a couple of steps when they saw the rebel crewmen in position ahead, firing down the corridor. In seconds, the passageway was filled with smoke and crisscrossing beams of energy.
"This is all your fault,"
he shouted angrily.
"I don't know why you insisted we come down this stupid access corridor. Not that it matters now. The whole ship must be—"
R2-D2 cut him off in mid-speech with some angry beepings and hoots of his own.
"Is that so?"
3PO sneered in reply.
"Well, the same to you, you little—"
An exceptionally violent explosion shook the passage, drowning him out. 2 meters tall, bipedal, flowing black robes trailing from the figure, and a face forever masked by a bizarre black metal breath screen. A dark lord of the Sith was an awesome shape as it strode through the corridors of the rebel ship. Fear followed the footsteps of the Dark Lord. The cloud of evil which clung tight about him was intense enough to cause hardened Imperial troops to back away. Once resolute rebel crew members ceased resisting, broke and ran in panic at the sight of the black armor that was not nearly as dark as the thoughts drifting through the mind within. One purpose dominated that mind now. It burned in the brain of Darth Vader as he turned down another passageway in the broken fighter. Only a robot was left to stir freely in the wake of the Dark Lord's passing. 3PO glanced around. R2-D2, where are you? The smoke seemed to part a bit. 3PO found himself staring up the passageway. R2-D2, it seemed, was there, but he wasn't looking in 3PO's direction. The little robot appeared frozen in an attitude of attention. Leaning over him was a young, slim human figure. One small hand seemed to be moving over the front of R2's torso. 3PO started toward them as the haze thickened once more, but when he reached the end of the corridor, only R2 stood there, waiting. "Where have you been?" 3PO finally asked. "Hiding, I suppose. They'll be coming back this way," he went on, "looking for human survivors. What are we going to do now? We'll be sent to the spice mines of Kessel, or taken apart for spare components for other, less deserving robots." But R2 had already turned and was ambling quickly back down the passageway. "Wait, where are you going?" Uttering curses in several languages, 3PO raced after his friend. Outside the galactic cruiser's control center, the corridor was crowded with sullen prisoners gathered by Imperial troops. As if on command, everyone became silent as a massive caped form came into view. Two of the heretofore resolute rebel officers began to shake. Stopping before one of them, the towering figure reached out wordlessly. A massive hand closed around the man's neck and lifted him off the deck. The rebel officer's eyes bulged, but he kept his silence. An Imperial officer scrambled down out of the fighter's control room, shaking his head briskly. "Nothing, sir. Information retrieval system's been wiped clean." Darth Vader acknowledged this news with a barely perceptible nod. The impenetrable mask turned to regard the officer he was torturing. Metal-clad fingers contracted. The prisoner desperately tried to pry them loose, but to no avail. "What have you done with the information tapes?" Vader rumbled.
"We intercepted no information. This is a consular vessel. We're on a diplomatic mission."
"Chaos take your mission. Where are those tapes?" He squeezed harder. The officer's voice was a bare, choked whisper.
"Oh, only the commander knows."
Thick fingers tightened further, and the officer's struggles became more frantic. His last words were choked past intelligibility. That hand continued to tighten, producing a chilling snapping and popping of bone. Then, with a disgusted wheeze, Vader threw the doll form of the dead man against a far wall. The massive form whirled, and Imperial officers shrank under that baleful stare. "Start tearing this ship apart until you find those tapes. As for the passengers, if any, I want them alive." R2-D2 finally came to a halt in an empty corridor devoid of the signs of battle. A worried, confused 3PO pulled up behind him as the squat robot reached up with one clawed limb and snapped the seal on a lifeboat hatch. "You're not permitted in there. It's restricted to humans only." Somehow, R2 had succeeded in wedging his body into position in front of the control board. He threw a stream of loud beeps and whistles at his reluctant companion. 3PO listened. "Mission? What mission? You sound like you haven't got an integrated logic terminal left in your brain. No more adventures. I'm not getting in there.
An angry electronic twang came from the R2 unit. "Don't call me a mindless philosopher," 3PO snapped back. He was concocting a rejoinder when an explosion blew out the back wall of the corridor. Muttering, the lanky robot jumped into the life pod. "Oh, I'm going to regret this," he muttered as R2 activated the safety door behind him. The smaller robot flipped a series of switches, and with the thunder of explosive latches, the life pod ejected from the crippled fighter. The binding that locked the girl's hands behind her back was primitive and effective. The constant attention the squad of troopers favored her with might have been out of place for one small female, except for the fact that their lives depended on her being delivered safely. Above her towered Darth Vader, red eyes glaring behind the hideous breath mask. A muscle twitched in one smooth cheek, but other than that, the girl didn't react, nor was there the slightest shake in her voice. "Darth Vader, only you would be so bold. Well, the Imperial Senate will not sit still for this. When they hear that you have attacked a diplomatic mission..."
Senator Leia Organa, don't play games with me, Your Highness. You aren't on any mercy mission. You pass directly through a restricted system.
The huge metal skull dipped close.
I know that several transmissions were beamed to this vessel by spies within that system. I want to know what happened to the data they sent you.
"I don't know what you're blathering about," she snapped, looking away from him. "I'm a member of the Senate on a diplomatic mission
to your part of the Rebel Alliance," Vader declared. "You're also a traitor." His gaze went to a nearby officer. "Take her away." When she was gone, a commander attracted Vader's attention. "Holding her is dangerous," he ventured. "If word of this does get out, there will be much unrest in the Senate. It will generate sympathy for the rebels. She should be destroyed immediately." "No. My first duty is to locate that hidden fortress of theirs. All the rebel spies have been eliminated. Therefore, she is now my only key to discovering its location." A cluster of tired-looking troops marched purposefully up to their commander and the Dark Lord. "The data tapes in question are not aboard the ship," the officer in charge recited mechanically. "Nor were there any transmissions directed outward from the time we made contact. A malfunctioning lifeboat pod was ejected during the fighting, but no life forms were on board." Vader appeared thoughtful. "It could have been a malfunctioning pod. It might also have contained the tapes. Send down a detachment to retrieve them, or to make certain they are not in the pod. If those data tapes exist, they must be retrieved or destroyed at all costs. With that accomplished and the Senator in our hands, we will see the end of this absurd rebellion."
"What a forsaken place this is." 3PO turned cautiously to look back at where the pod lay half buried in the sand. High sandstone mesas dominated the skyline to one side. Every other direction showed only an endless series of marching dunes, like long yellow teeth. A faint cloud of minute dust particles rose in their wake as the two robots marched away from the pod. "Well, we seem to have been made to suffer," 3PO moaned. Something squeaked in his right leg, and he winced. "I've got to rest before I fall apart." He paused, but R2-D2 did not. The little automaton was ambling slowly but steadily in the direction of the nearest mesa. "Now, where do you think you're going?" R2 paused, emitting a stream of electronic explanation. "Well, I'm not going that way," 3PO declared. "It's too rocky." A long whistle issued from the depths of R2. "Well, don't get technical with me," 3PO warned. "I've had just about enough of your decisions." R2 beeped once. "All right, go your way. You'll be sandlogged within a day, you nearsighted scrap pile." 3PO started off toward the glaring horizon, glancing back over his shoulder. "Don't let me catch you following me, begging for help." Because you won't get it. The R2 unit trudged off toward the sandstone ridges. Several hours later, a straining 3PO struggled up the top of what he hoped was the last towering dune. Reaching the crest of the dune, 3PO peered anxiously ahead. Instead of the hoped-for greenery of human civilization, he saw only several dozen more dunes, identical to the one he now stood upon. 3PO turned and looked back toward the now far-off rocky plateau. "You malfunctioning little twerp," he muttered. "This is all your fault. You tricked me into going this way, but you'll do no better." Nor would he, if he didn't continue on. Already his receptors were beginning to go, he reflected. It seemed he saw something moving in the distance. Heat distortion, probably. No, it was definitely light on metal, and it was moving toward him. His hopes soared. He rose and began waving frantically. He neglected, in his excitement, to consider the possibility that it might not be of human origin. R2 made his careful way up a rocky arroyo, hunting for the easiest pathway to the top. His squarish, broad footpads made clicking sounds in the evening light as sand gave way gradually to gravel. For a moment, he paused. He seemed to detect a noise, like metal on rock, ahead of him. The sound wasn't repeated, though, and he quickly resumed his ambling ascent. Far up the arroyo, a pebble trickled loose from the stone wall. The tiny figure which had dislodged the pebble retreated mouse-like into shadow. Two glowing points of light showed under overlapping folds of brown cape. Only the reaction of the unsuspecting robot indicated the presence of the whining beam as it struck him. 3 travesties of men scurried out from behind concealing boulders. Their motions were more indicative of rodent than humankind, and they stood little taller than the R2 unit. When they saw that they had immobilized the robot, they holstered their peculiar weapons. The Jawas conversed in low guttural croaks and scrambled analogues of human speech. Several more Jawas appeared. Together, they succeeded in alternately dragging the robot back down the arroyo. At the bottom of the canyon, like some monstrous prehistoric beast, was a sand crawler, as enormous as its owners were tiny. On reaching the crawler, the Jawas resumed jabbering among themselves. One of them removed a small disc from a belt pouch and sealed it to the R2 unit's flank. A large tube protruded from one side of the gargantuan vehicle. They rolled him over to it and then moved clear. There was a brief moan, the whoosh of a powerful vacuum, and the small robot was sucked into the bowels of the sand crawler as neatly as a pea up a straw. This part of the job completed, the Jawas scurried into the crawler via tubes and ladders, for all the world like a nest of mice returning to their holes. None too gently, the suction tube deposited R2 in a small cubicle. In addition to varied piles of broken instruments and scrap, a dozen or so robots of differing shapes and sizes populated the prison. A few were locked in electronic conversation. Others muddled aimlessly about. But one voice burst out in surprise. "R2-D2! It's you! It's you!" called an excited 3PO. He made his way over to the still immobilized repair unit and embraced it most unmechanically. Spotting the small disc sealed onto R2's side, 3PO turned his gaze thoughtfully down to his own chest, where a similar device had likewise been attached. Massive gears started to move. Groaning and grinding, the monster sandcrawler turned and lumbered into the desert night. The burnished conference table was as soulless and unyielding as the Imperial officers ranged around it. One of the 8 was declaiming. General Tag exhibited the attitude of one who had climbed far and fast by methods best not examined too closely. "I tell you, he's gone too far this time," the general was insisting vehemently. "This Sith Lord will be our undoing. Until the battle station is fully operational, we remain vulnerable. Some of you still don't seem to realize how well equipped and organized the Rebel Alliance is, and they are propelled by something more powerful than mere engines. This perverse, reactionary fanaticism of theirs. They're more dangerous than most of you realize." An older officer shifted in his chair. "Dangerous to your Starfleet, General Tag, but not to this battle station." Tag objected. "I beg to differ, Ramadi. Within the Senate, the rebels will continue to increase their support as long—" The sound of the single doorway sliding aside cut him off. 2 individuals as different in appearance as they were united in objectives had entered the chamber. The nearest to Tag was a thin, hatchet-faced man with the expression of a quiescent piranha. The Grand Muff Tarkin, governor of numerous outlying imperial territories, was dwarfed by the broad, armored bulk of Lord Darth Vader. Tag slowly resumed his seat as Tarkin assumed his place at the end of the conference table. "The Imperial Senate will no longer be of any concern to us, gentlemen. The Emperor has permanently dissolved that misguided body." A ripple of astonishment ran through the assembly. "The last remnants of the old Republic have finally been swept away." "Well, this is impossible," Tag interjected. "How will the Emperor maintain control of the Imperial bureaucracy?" "From now on, fear will keep local governments in line. Fear of the Imperial fleet and fear of this battle station." "And what of the existing rebellion?" Tag wanted to know. "If the rebels somehow manage to gain access to a complete technical schema of this battle station, it is remotely possible that they might be able to locate a weakness." Tarkin said, "It is immaterial. Any attack made against this station would be suicidal." Vader's metal-clad hand gestured slightly, and one of the filled cups on the table drifted into it. With a slightly admonishing tone, the Dark Lord said, "Don't become too proud of this technological terror you've spawned, Tarkin. The ability to destroy a world is still insignificant when set against the Force." "The Force?" Tag sneered. "Don't try to frighten us with your sorcerer's ways, Lord Vader. Your sad devotion to that ancient mythology has not helped you to conjure up those stolen tapes or to locate the rebels' hidden fortress." Tag's eyes abruptly bulged, and his hands went to his throat as he began to turn a disconcerting shade of blue. "I find this lack of faith disturbing." "Enough of this," Tarkin snapped, distressed. "Vader, release him." Vader shrugged. Tag slumped in his seat, rubbing his throat, his wary gaze never leaving the dark giant. "Lord Vader will provide us with the location of the rebel fortress by the time this station is operational," Tarkin declared. "That known, we will proceed to it and destroy it utterly, crushing this pathetic rebellion in one swift stroke." The dim prison reeked of rancid oil and stale lubricants, a veritable metallic charnel house. "Will this never end?" 3PO was moaning as a violent jolt roughly jostled the inhabitants of the prison. The sandcrawler's whine died, and the vehicle came to a halt, almost as if in response to 3PO's query. Local captives had explained the nature of the quasi-human mechanic migrants, the Jawas. Traveling in their enormous mobile fortress homes, they scoured the most inhospitable regions of Tatooine in search of valuable minerals and salvageable machinery. "Wake up! Wake up!" 3PO urged. "We've stopped." Abruptly, the far wall of the chamber slid aside, and the blinding white glare of a Tatooine morning rushed in on them. Several of the repulsive-looking Jawas scrambled agilely into the chamber, still dressed in the same swathings and filth 3PO had observed on them before. The Jawas prodded at the machines. Certain of them, 3PO noted, did not stir. Ignoring the immobile ones, the Jawas herded those still capable of movement outside, R2 and 3PO among them. Both robots found themselves part of an uneven mechanical line. Shielding his eyes against the glare, 3PO studied the small domes and vaporators that indicated the presence of a larger underground human homestead. Though he was unfamiliar with this type of construction, all signs pointed to a modest, if isolated, habitation. His spirits rose correspondingly. "Maybe this won't be so bad after all," he murmured hopefully. "If we can convince these bipedal vermin to unload us here, we may enter into sensible human service again." 3PO failed to notice the two figures moving toward them from the region of the largest dome. R2 had to nudge him slightly before he looked up. The first man wore an air of grim exhaustion, sandblasted into his face by years of arguing with a hostile environment. Dust frosted his face, clothes, hands, and thoughts, but the body, if not the spirit, was still powerful. Proportionately dwarfed by his uncle's wrestler-like body, Luke Skywalker strode slump-shouldered in his shadow. A slight breeze tugged at his shaggy hair and baggy work tunic. The bigger man stopped before the assembly and entered into a peculiar squeaky dialogue with the Jawa in charge. When they wished it, the Jawas could be understood. Luke shuffled along behind his uncle as the latter began inspecting the 5 machines, pausing only to mutter an occasional word or two to his nephew. It was hard to pay attention, even though he knew he ought to be learning. "Luke! Oh, Luke!" a voice called. Turning away from the conversation, Luke walked over to the near edge of the subterranean courtyard and peered down. A stout woman was busy working among decorative plants. She looked up at him. "Be sure and tell Owen that if he buys a translator, to make sure it speaks Bachi, Luke." "Well, it looks like we don't have much of a choice," he called back. "But I'll remind him." She nodded up at him, and he turned to rejoin his uncle. Apparently, Owen Lars had already settled on a small, semi-agricultural robot. This one was similar in shape to R2-D2, save that its multiple subsidiary arms were tipped with different functions. Proceeding to the end of the line, the farmer's eyes narrowed as he concentrated on the sand-scoured but still flashy bronze finish of 3PO. "I presume you function," he grumbled. "Do you know customs and protocol?" "Do I know protocol?" 3PO echoed as the farmer looked him up and down. "Why, it's my primary function." "Don't need a protocol, droid," the farmer snapped dryly. "Well, I don't blame you, sir. What could be more of a wasteful luxury in a climate like this? But I've been programmed for over 30 secondary functions that require only—" "I need," the farmer broke in, "a droid that knows something about the binary language of moisture vaporators." "Vaporators? We are both in luck," 3PO countered. "My first post-primary assignment was in programming binary load lifters, very similar to your vaporators." "Do you speak Bachi?" "Of course, sir. It's like a second language to me. I'm as fluent in Bachi as—" "Shut up." Owen Lars looked down at the Jawa. "I'll take this one, too." "Shutting up, sir," responded 3PO quickly, hard put to conceal his glee at being selected. "Take them down to the garage, Luke," his uncle instructed him. "I want you to have both of them cleaned up by supper time." Luke looked askance at his uncle. "But I was going into Tashi Station to pick up some new power converters and—" "Don't lie to me, Luke," his uncle warned him sternly. "I don't mind you wasting time with your idle friends, but only after you've finished your chores. Now hop to it, and before supper, mind." Downcast, Luke directed his words irritably to 3PO and the small agricultural robot. He knew better than to argue with his uncle. "Follow me, you two." They started for the garage as Owen entered into price negotiations with the Jawa. Other Jawas were leading the 3 remaining machines back into the sand crawler when something let out an almost pathetic beep. Luke turned to see an R2 unit breaking formation and starting toward him. It was immediately restrained by a Jawa wielding a control device that activated the disk sealed on the machine's front plate. A minute later, something pinged sharply nearby. Glancing down, Luke saw that a head plate had popped off the top of the agricultural droid. A grinding noise was coming from within. A second later, the machine was throwing internal components all over the sandy ground. He called out, "Uncle Owen, the servo motor central on this cultivator unit is shot." Owen Lars glared down at the nervous Jawa. "What kind of junk are you trying to push on us?" The Jawa responded loudly, indignantly, while simultaneously taking a couple of precautionary steps away from the big human. R2 suddenly let out a high whistle, then broke it off when he had gained 3PO's attention. Tapping Luke gently on the shoulder, the tall droid whispered, "If I might say so, sir, that R2 unit is a real bargain, in top condition. I don't believe these creatures have any idea what good shape he's really in. Don't let all the sand and dust deceive you." "Uncle Owen," he called, and gestured toward R2-D2. "What about swapping this for that one?" The older man studied the R2 unit professionally, then resumed the argument for show's sake before gruffly assenting. The head Jawa consented reluctantly to the trade. Meanwhile, Luke had led the 2 robots toward an opening in the dry ground. The passage widened into the garage proper, which was cluttered with tools and sections of farming machinery. Near the center of the garage was a large tub, and the aroma drifting from it made 3PO's principal olfactory sensors twitch. Luke grinned, noting the robot's reaction. "Yes, it's a lubrication bath." He eyed the tall bronze robot appraisingly. "And from the looks of it, you could use about a week's submergence." Then Luke turned his attention to R2-D2, walking up to him and flipping open a panel that shielded numerous gauges. "As for you," he continued, "I don't know how you've kept running. It's recharge time for you." He gestured toward a large power unit. R2-D2 beeped once and waddled over to the boxy construction. Finding the proper cord, he flipped open a panel and plugged the triple prongs into his face. 3PO had walked over to the large cistern. With a remarkably human-like sigh, he lowered himself slowly into the tank. "You 2 behave yourselves," Luke cautioned as he moved to a small 2-man skyhopper, a powerful little suborbital spacecraft. "I've got work of my own to do." Unfortunately, Luke's mind was focused on distant, far more exciting adventures than repairing droids in a garage in the wastelands of Tatooine, so that hours later he had finished few of his chores. Abruptly, something came to a boil within him. With atypical violence, he threw a power wrench across a work table nearby. "It just isn't fair," he declared to no one in particular. "Biggs is right. I'll never get out of here." "I beg your pardon, sir?" Luke spun, startled. The contrast in 3PO was striking compared with Luke's initial sight of him. Bronze-colored alloy gleamed in the overhead lights of the garage, cleaned of pits and dust by the powerful oils. "Is there anything I might do to help?" "I doubt it," Luke replied, "unless you can alter time and speed up the harvest, or else teleport me off this sand pile." "I don't think so, sir. I'm not very knowledgeable about such things as transatomic physics. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure which planet I'm on." Luke chuckled sardonically. "If there's a bright center to this universe, you're on the world farthest from it." "Yes, Luke, sir." The youth shook his head irritably. "Well, never mind the sir. It's just Luke. And this world is called Tatooine." 3PO nodded slightly. Thank you, Luke. I am C-3PO, human-droid relations." He jerked a casual metal thumb back toward the recharge unit. "That is my companion, R2-D2.
"Pleased to meet you."
Luke said easily. He checked a gauge on the smaller machine's front panel, then gave a grunt of satisfaction. As he began unplugging the charge cord, he saw something which made him frown. Luke bent over R2 and began scraping at several bumps in the small droid's top with a chromed pick. Occasionally, he jerked back sharply as bits of corrosion were flicked into the air by the tiny tool. There's a lot of strange carbon scoring here. Looks like you've both seen a lot of action. Indeed, sir, 3PO admitted, forgetting to drop the honorific. Sometimes I'm amazed we're in as good shape as we are, what with the rebellion and all. An almost Jawa-like blaze appeared in Luke's eyes. You know about the rebellion against the Empire? In a way, 3PO confessed reluctantly, the rebellion was responsible for our coming into your service. We are refugees, you see. Not that Luke appeared to care. Refugees? He rambled on rapidly, excited. Tell me where you've been. In how many encounters? How is the rebellion going? Please, sir, 3PO pleaded. You misinterpret our status. Our involvement with the rebellion was of the most marginal nature. As to battles, we were in several, I think. It's difficult to tell when one is not directly in contact with the actual battle machinery. Luke turned away, disappointed, and returned to his cleaning of R2-D2. Well, my little friend, he murmured, you've got something jammed in here real good. Metal gave way with a powerful crack, and the recoil sent Luke tumbling head over heels. Getting to his feet, he started to curse, then froze, motionless. The front of the R2 unit had begun to glow, exuding a three-dimensional image, less than 1/3 of a meter square, but precisely defined. The portrait formed within the box was so exquisite. Despite a superficial sharpness, the image flickered and jiggled unsteadily, as if the recording had been made with haste. Then the lips on the figure moved, and the girl spoke. Obi-Wan Kenobi, the voice implored huskily. Help me. You're my only hope. A burst of static dissolved the face momentarily. Then it coalesced again, and the voice repeated. Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. With a raspy hum, the hologram continued. Luke sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then he blinked and directed his words to the R2 unit. What's this all about, R2-D2? The R2 unit generated a beep of surprise, as if just noticing the hologram. This was followed by a whistling stream of information. 3PO digested the data. He insists it's nothing, sir. Merely old data. He insists we paid no mind. Who is she? He demanded, staring enraptured at the hologram. She's beautiful. I really don't know who she is, 3PO confessed honestly. I think she might have been a passenger on our last voyage. Is there any more to this recording? It sounds like it's incomplete. Getting to his feet, Luke reached out for the R2 unit. The robot moved backward and produced whistles of such frantic concern that Luke hesitated. 3PO said, He says that he is the property of one Obi-Wan Kenobi, a resident of this world. The sentence fragment we are hearing is part of a private message intended for this person. Quite frankly, sir, I don't know what he's talking about. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Luke recited thoughtfully. His expression suddenly brightened. Say, I wonder if he could be referring to old Ben Kenobi. I don't know anyone named Obi-Wan, but old Ben lives somewhere out on the fringe of the western Dunes Sea. He's kind of a local character, a hermit. Uncle Owen and a few of the other farmers say he's a sorcerer. Luke's gaze was drawn irresistibly back to the hologram. I wonder who she is. She must be important, especially if what you told me just now is true, 3PO. Maybe the message is important. We ought to hear the rest of it. He reached again for the R2's internal controls, and the robot scurried backward again, squeaking a blue streak. He says there's a restraining separator bolt that's circuiting out his self-motivation components, 3PO translated. He suggests that if you move the bolt, he might be able to repeat the entire message. Luke considered the request. Well, I guess you're too small to run away from me if I take this off. I wonder what someone would be sending a message to old Ben for. Selecting the proper tool, Luke reached down into the exposed circuitry and popped the restraining bolt free. The portrait disappeared. Where did she go? Play the entire message, R2-D2. R2 sat and hummed softly to himself. A voice from down a corridor interrupted him. "Luke, come to dinner." Luke hesitated, then turned away from the puzzling little droid. "Okay," he called. "I'm coming, Aunt Beru." He lowered his voice as he spoke to 3PO. "See what you can do with him. I'll be back soon." He hurried from the chamber. A plaintive beep came from R2. "No," 3PO responded. "I don't think he likes you at all." A second beep failed to alter 3PO's tone. "No, I don't like you either." Aunt Beru was filling a pitcher with blue liquid. In the dining area, a steady buzz of conversation reached to the kitchen. "I think that R2 unit might have been stolen, Uncle Owen," Luke was saying. His uncle mumbled his reply around a mouthful of food. "What makes you think the droid is stolen?" "It claims to be the property of someone called Obi-Wan Kenobi. Do you know who he's talking about?" Surprisingly, his uncle looked uncomfortable instead of angry. "It's nothing. A name from another time. A name that can only mean trouble." Luke refused to heed the implied warning. "Is it someone related to old Ben, then? I didn't know he had any relatives." "You stay away from that old wizard, do you hear me?" his uncle exploded. "Owen," Aunt Beru entered and started to interject. "Now, this is important, Beru." He turned his attention back to his nephew. "I've told you about Kenobi before. He's a crazy old man. He's dangerous and full of mischief, and he's best left well alone." Beru's pleading gaze caused him to quiet somewhat. "That droid has nothing to do with him. Couldn't have. Tomorrow, I want you to take the unit into Anchorhead and have its memory flushed." "But suppose it does belong to someone else," Luke wondered. "What if this Obi-Wan person comes looking for his droid?" An expression between sorrow and a sneer crossed his uncle's seamed face. "He won't. I don't think that man exists anymore. He died about the same time as your father. Now, forget about it." "Then it was a real person," Luke murmured. He added slowly, "Did he know my father?" "I said forget about it," Owen snapped. "Your only worry, as far as those two droids are concerned, is having them ready for work tomorrow." "You know," Luke replied distantly, "I was thinking about our agreement about me staying on for another season. If these new droids do work out, I want to transmit my application to enter the academy for next year." "Listen," his uncle told him, "for the first time, we've got a chance for a real fortune. We'll make enough to hire some extra hands for next time. Then you can go to the academy." He fumbled over words, unaccustomed to pleading. "I need you here, Luke." "It's another year," his nephew objected sullenly. Convinced that Luke had come round to his way of thinking, Owen shrugged the objection off. "Time will pass before you know it." Abruptly, Luke rose. "That's what you said last year when Biggs left. And now they say he's gone off to join the rebellion." He spun and half ran from the room. Silence hung in the air of the dining room. Husband and wife ate mechanically. Eventually, Aunt Beru said, "Luke's just not a farmer, Owen. He's got too much of his father in him." For the first time all evening, Owen Lars looked thoughtful as well as concerned. That's what I'm afraid of. Luke descended into the garage. Maybe working on the droids would bury some of the remorse a little deeper in his mind. A quick survey of the chamber showed no movement. Frowning slightly, Luke took a small control box from his belt and activated a couple of switches. A low hum came from the box. The caller produced the taller of the two robots, 3PO. In fact, he gave a yell of surprise as he jumped up behind the skyhopper. Luke started toward him. "What are you hiding back there for?" "It wasn't my fault. Please, don't deactivate me. I told him not to go." "You mean—" Luke started to gape. "Yes, sir. R2 is gone." Luke raced out of the garage, 3PO following on his heels. From a small ridge near the homestead, Luke had a panoramic view of the surrounding desert. Bringing out the precious macro binoculars, he scanned the rapidly darkening horizons for something small, three-legged, and out of its mechanical mind. "Well, he's nowhere in sight." He kicked furiously at the ground. "Uncle Owen's going to kill me." "Begging your pardon, sir, but can't we go after him?" "Not at night. It's too dangerous with all the raiders around. We'll have to wait until morning to try to track him. That little droid's going to get me in a lot of trouble." "Oh, he excels at that, sir." Together, they turned and descended into the garage. An unseen face, shielded by smooth white metal, emerged from the half-buried life pod. The voice sounded efficient, but tired. "Nothing," the inspecting trooper muttered to his several companions. "No tapes and no sign of habitation." One of the armored men turned, calling out to an officer standing some distance away. "Well, this is definitely the pod that cleared the rebel ship, sir, but there's nothing on board." "Yet it's set down intact," the officer was murmuring to himself. "Now here's why there's nothing on board and no hint of life, sir." A trooper was kneeling in the sand. He held up an object for the officer's inspection. "Droid plating," the officer observed after a quick glance at the metal fragment. Superior and underling exchanged a significant glance. Then their eyes turned simultaneously to the high mesas to the north. Gravel and fine sand formed a gritty fog beneath the land speeder as it slid across the rippling wasteland of Tatooine. Luke leaned back in the seat, luxuriating in unaccustomed relaxation as 3PO skillfully directed the powerful landcraft around dunes and rocky outcrops. Old Ben Kenobi is supposed to live out in this general direction, even though nobody knows exactly where. I don't see how that R2 unit could have come this far so quickly. Wait a minute. He stared fixedly at the instrument panel. There's something dead ahead on the metal scanner. Judging by size alone, it could be our wandering droid. Hit it. The land speeder jumped forward as 3PO engaged the accelerator, but its occupants were totally unaware that other eyes were watching as the craft increased its speed. Those eyes were not organic, but then they weren't wholly mechanical either. No one could say for certain because no one had ever made that intimate a study of the Tusken Raiders, known to the farmers of Tatooine simply as the Sand People. "It's him, all right," Luke declared as the tiny tripodal form came into view. The speeder banked and swung down onto the floor of a huge sandstone canyon. Luke slipped his rifle out from behind the seat and swung it over his shoulder. Come round in front of him, 3PO. The R2 unit obviously noted their approach, but made no move to escape. 3PO came to a sharp halt, sending up a low cloud of sand on the smaller robot's right. After finishing a cautious survey of the canyon, Luke led his companion out onto the gravelly surface and up to R2-D2. "Just where," he inquired sharply, "did you think you were going?" Without warning, the R2 unit suddenly leaped off the ground. His cylindrical body was twisting and spinning as he let out a frantic symphony of whistles, hoots, and electronic exclamations. "Oh my, sir. R2 claims there are several creatures approaching from the southeast." Luke suddenly realized exactly how far out they were, how much ground the land speeder had covered that morning. His curiosity prodded him. "Well, let's take a look." Moving cautiously forward and keeping his rifle ready, he led 3PO toward the crest of a nearby high dune. Once at the top, he lay flat and traded his rifle for the macro binoculars. Below, another canyon spread out before them, rising to a wind-weathered wall of rust and ochre. Advancing the binocs slowly across the canyon floor, he settled unexpectedly on two tethered shapes. "Panthers," Luke whispered. "It's sand people, sure. I see one of them." Something dark suddenly blocked his sight. Irritably, he reached out to move the blinding object aside. His hand touched something like soft metal. It was a bandaged leg, about as big around as both of Luke's together. Shocked, he looked up, and up. A towering figure glaring down at him. It had seemingly erupted straight from the sand. 3PO took a startled step backward and found no footing. As gyros whined in protest, the tall robot tumbled backward down the side of the dune. The Tusken let out a terrifying grunt of fury and brought down his heavy Gaddafi. The double-edged axe would have cleaved Luke's skull neatly in two, except that he threw the rifle up in a gesture more instinctive than calculated. His weapon deflected the blow, but would never do so again. The huge axe made metallic confetti of the gun's delicate insides. The raider stalked him slowly, weapon held high over its rag-enclosed head. It uttered a gruesome, chuckling laugh. Luke tried to view his situation objectively, as he had been instructed to do in survival school. But with the raider in front of him, and a probably fatal drop behind, something else in his mind took over, and opted for the least painful response. He fainted. None of the raiders noticed R2-D2 as the tiny robot forced himself into a small alcove in the rocks near the land speeder. One of them was carrying the inert form of Luke. He dumped the unconscious youth in a heap next to the speeder, then joined his fellows as they began swarming over the open craft. Unexpectedly, distribution of the land speeder's contents ceased. Far off to the west, something howled. A rolling, booming drone ricocheted off canyon walls. The sand people uttered loud grunts and moans of fright as they rushed to get away from the highly visible land speeder. The shivering howl sounded again, nearer this time. By now, the sand people were halfway to their waiting banthas. Although the sound held no meaning for R2-D2, the little droid tried to squeeze himself even deeper into the almost cave. The booming howl came closer. Judging by the way the sand people had reacted, something monstrous had to be behind that rolling cry. R2-D2 shut down all but vital functions, trying to minimize noise and light as a swishing sound grew gradually audible. Moving toward the land speeder, the creature appeared above the top of a nearby dune. The monster looked very much like an old man, clad in a shabby cloak and loose robes. R2 searched the human's wake, but detected no evidence of a pursuing nightmare. Nor did the man appear threatened. Actually, R2 thought, he looked kind of pleased. The man smiled, squinting at the sight of the crumpled form lying quietly alongside the land speeder. R2 shifted his position slightly, trying to obtain a better view. The sound produced by a tiny pebble he dislodged was barely perceptible to his electronic sensors, but the man whirled as if shot. He stared straight at R2's alcove, still smiling gently. "Hello there," he called in a deeply, surprisingly cheerful voice. "Come here, my little friend. No need to be afraid." Something forthright and reassuring was in that voice. Waddling out into the sunlight, R2 made his way over to where Luke lay sprawled. The robot's barrel-like body inclined forward as he examined the limp form. Luke blinked, stared upward uncomprehendingly, and muttered, "What happened?" "Rest easy, son," the man instructed him. "You've had a busy day." Luke looked around, his gaze coming to rest on the elderly face hovering above him. "Ben Kenobi, am I glad to see you." The old man surveyed the canyon floor. "The Jutland wastes are not to be traveled lightly. It's the misguided traveler who tempts the Tuscan's hospitality." His gaze went back to his patient. "Tell me, young man, what brings you out this far into nowhere?" Luke indicated R2-D2. "This little droid. For a while I thought he'd gone crazy. He claims to be the property of someone called Obi-Wan Kenobi." An introspective frown crossed that sand-blasted face. Obi-Wan. Now, that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Most curious. "My uncle said he was dead," Luke supplied helpfully. "Oh, he's not dead," Kenobi corrected him easily. "Not yet." Luke climbed excitedly to his feet, all thoughts of Tuscan raiders forgotten. "You know him, then?" "Of course I know him. He's me. I haven't gone by the name of Obi-Wan, though, since before you were born." Something drew the old man's gaze suddenly to the brow of nearby cliffs. "I think it's best we make use of your land speeder. The sand people are easily startled, but they'll soon return in greater numbers." "I won't argue that." Luke was rubbing at the back of his head. "Let's get started." That was when R2 let out a pathetic beep. Luke couldn't interpret the electronic squeal, but he suddenly comprehended the reason behind it. 3PO! Come on, Ben. 3PO lay in the sand at the base of the slope down which he had rolled and tumbled. His casing was dented and badly mangled. One arm lay broken and bent a short distance away. "3PO!" Luke called. There was no response. Opening a plate on the robot's back, Luke flipped a hidden switch on and off several times in succession. A low hum started, stopped, started again, and then dropped to a normal purr. Using his remaining arm, 3PO rolled over and sat up. "Where am I?" he murmured. Then he recognized Luke. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I must have taken a bad step." With Luke and Ben Kenobi's aid, the battered droid somehow managed to struggle erect. Kenobi sniffed the air suspiciously. "Quickly, son. They're on the move again." Trying to watch the surrounding rocks and his footsteps simultaneously, Luke fought to drag 3PO clear of the pit. The decor of Ben Kenobi's cave was Spartan without appearing uncomfortable. Luke spent several hours in the corner, which was equipped as a compact yet complete repair shop, working to fix 3PO's severed arm. While Luke was thus occupied, Kenobi's attention was concentrated on R2-D2. The squat droid sat passively on the cavern floor while the old man fiddled with its metal insides. "Now, let's see if we can figure out where you came from, my little friend." Once more, the striking portrait was being projected into empty space from the front of the little robot. "Yes, I think that's got it." General Obi-Wan Kenobi, the mellifluous voice was saying, "I present myself in the name of Alderaan and of the Alliance to Restore the Republic. I break your solitude at the bidding of my father, Bail Organa, first chairman of the Alderaan system. Years ago, General, you served the old Republic in the Clone Wars. Now my father begs you to aid us again in our most desperate hour. He would have you join him on Alderaan. You must go to him. Information vital to the survival of the Alliance has been secured in the mind of this droid. My father will know how to retrieve it. I plead with you to see this unit safely delivered to Alderaan." She paused, and when she continued, her words were hurried. "You must help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You are my last hope. I will be captured by agents of the Empire. They will learn nothing from me. Everything to be learned lies locked in the memory cells of this droid. Do not fail us, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Do not fail me." A small cloud of tridimensional static replaced the delicate portrait. Then it vanished entirely. "General Kenobi, you fought in the Clone Wars? But that was so long ago."
Yes. I guess it was a while back. I was a Jedi Knight once, like your father.
"A Jedi Knight," Luke echoed. "But my father was no knight, just a navigator on a space freighter." Kenobi's smile enfolded the pipe's mouthpiece.
Or so your uncle has told you. Owen Laws didn't agree with your father's ideas. He believed that your father should have stayed here on Tatooine and minded his farming.
Luke turned away. "I wish I'd known him," he finally whispered.
He was the best pilot I ever knew, and a smart fighter. The Force was strong in him. He was also a good friend. All this reminds me, I have something here for you."
He rose and walked over to a bulky, old-fashioned chest.
"When you were old enough, your father wanted you to have this."
He handed Luke a small, innocuous-looking device. It consisted primarily of a short, thick hand grip with a couple of small switches set into the grip. Above this small post was a circular metal disc, barely larger in diameter than his spread palm. A number of unfamiliar, jewel-like components were built into both handle and disc, including what looked like the smallest power cell Luke had ever seen. "What is it?" Luke finally asked.
"Your father's lightsaber,"
Kenobi told him. Luke examined the controls on the handle, then tentatively touched a brightly colored button up near the pommel. Instantly, the disc put forth a blue-white beam as thick around as his thumb and a little over a meter in length. It did not fade, but remained as brilliant and intense at its far end as it did next to the disc. Strangely, Luke felt no heat from it, though he was very careful not to touch it. He knew that a lightsaber could drill a hole right through the rock wall of Kenobi's cave, or through a human being.
"This was the formal weapon of a Jedi Knight," explained Kenobi. "More skill than simple sight was required for its use. For over 1,000 generations, Luke, the Jedi Knights were the most powerful, most respected force in the galaxy. They served as the guardians and guarantors of peace and justice in the Old Republic."
"How," asked Luke slowly, "did my father die?"
"He was betrayed and murdered," Kenobi declared solemnly, "by a very young Jedi named Darth Vader. One of my brightest disciples, one of my greatest failures."
Kenobi resumed his pacing.
"Vader used the Force for evil. With the Jedi Knights disbanded, disorganized, or dead, there were few to oppose Vader. Today, they are all but extinct."
Luke's face twisted in confusion. "A force? That's the second time you've mentioned a force." Kenobi nodded. Let us say simply that the Force is something a Jedi must deal with. It is an energy field generated by living things. The Force surrounds each and every one of us. Knowledge of the Force and how to manipulate it was what gave the Jedi his special power. You must learn the ways of the Force also, Luke, if you are to come with me to Alderaan.
Alderaan? Luke looked dazed. I'm not going to Alderaan. I've got to get back home.
I need your help, Luke. I'm getting too old for this kind of thing. This mission is far too important.
But I can't get involved with anything like that, protested Luke. I've got work to do. Besides, that's all such a long way from here.
Remember, Luke, the suffering of one man is the suffering of all. Distances are irrelevant to injustice. If not stopped soon enough, evil eventually reaches out to engulf all men.
I suppose, Luke confessed nervously, I could take you as far as Anchorhead.
Very well. That will do for a beginning. Look over there, Luke, Kenobi ordered, pointing to the southwest. The land speeder continued to race over the gravelly desert floor beneath them. Smoke, I should think. Luke turned the speeder. The speeder dropped down into a broad, shallow canyon that was filled with twisted, burned shapes. Dead in the center of this carnage lay the shattered hulk of a Jawa sandcrawler. Luke brought the speeder to a halt. Kenobi followed him onto the sand, and together they began to examine the detritus of destruction. Look at these tracks carefully, the old man directed him. Whoever left here was riding banthas side by side. Sand people always ride one bantha behind another to hide their numbers. Kenobi turned his attention to the sandcrawler. Look at the precision with which this firepower was applied. Sand people aren't this accurate. Only Imperial troops would mount an attack with this kind of cold accuracy.
These are the same Jawas who sold Uncle Owen and me R2 and 3PO. Why would Imperial troops be slaughtering Jawas and sand people? His mind worked furiously. He looked at the two droids. But if they tracked the droids to the Jawas, then they had to learn first who they sold them to. That would lead them back to... Luke was sprinting insanely for the land speeder.
Luke, wait. It's too dangerous.
Luke jumped into the speeder. In an explosion of sand and gravel, he left Kenobi and the two robots framed by the still smoking wreck of the sandcrawler. The smoke that Luke saw as he drew near the homestead was of a different consistency from that which had boiled out of the Jawa machine. Dark smoke was drifting steadily from holes in the ground. Those holes had been his home, the only one he had ever known. Two smoking shapes showed down the tunnel, barely visible through tears and haze. They almost looked like... He squinted harder, wiping angrily at his uncooperative eyes.
No!
Then he was spinning away, falling to his stomach and burying his face in the sand so he wouldn't have to look anymore. Darth Vader stood, flanked by Governor Tarkin and by Admiral Mati and General Tagg, their private antagonisms forgotten in the awesomeness of this moment.
The final checkout is complete, Mati informed them. All systems are operational. What shall be the first course we set?
Vader appeared not to have heard as he mumbled softly.
She has a surprising amount of control. Her resistance is considerable.
He glanced down at Tarkin.
It will be some time before we can extract any useful information from her.
Tarkin looked thoughtful. Such stubbornness can often be detoured by applying threats to something other than the one involved.
What do you mean?
Only that I think it is time we demonstrated the full power of this station, he instructed the attentive Mati. Set course
for Alderaan. At a rising thrumming, Kenobi turned to see the land speeder approaching. The canopy flipped open to reveal Luke sitting motionless in the pilot's seat. He didn't look up at Kenobi's inquiring glance. That in itself was enough to tell the old man what had happened. "I share your sorrow, Luke. There was nothing you could have done. I'll take you to the spaceport at Mos Eisley, Ben. I want to go with you. To Alderaan. I want to learn to be a Jedi. Like my father." Kenobi slid into the cockpit, put a hand gently on the youth's shoulder. "I'll do my best to see that you get what you want, Luke. For now, let's go to Mos Eisley." The town was larger than it appeared, since a good portion of it lay underground. The smooth circular depressions of launch stations pockmarked the cityscape like bomb craters. There it is, Mos Eisley Spaceport. Not a more wretched collection of villainy exists anywhere on Tatooine. The Empire has been alerted to us, so we must be very cautious, Luke. The population of Mos Eisley should disguise us well. Luke was maneuvering the land speeder through the town's outskirts when several gleaming forms appeared from nowhere and began to close a circle around him. One of the troopers raised an armored hand. Luke had no choice but to respond. "How long have you had these droids?" the trooper barked. Looking blank for a second, Luke finally said, 3 or 4 seasons, I guess." "They're up for sale, if you want them," Kenobi put in. The trooper walked around to study the speeder's front. Then he moved to stand ominously close to Luke and snapped, "Let me see your identification." "You don't need to see his identification," Kenobi said in an extremely peculiar voice. Staring blankly back at him, the officer replied as if it was self-evident. "I don't need to see your identification." "These aren't the droids you're looking for," Kenobi told him pleasantly. "These aren't the droids we're looking for." "He can go about his business." "You can go about your business," the officer informed Luke. "Move along," Kenobi whispered. "Move along," the officer instructed Luke. Unable to decide whether he should salute, nod, or give thanks, Luke settled for nudging the accelerator. The land speeder moved forward, drawing away from the circle of troops. He peered at his companion and started to say something. Kenobi only shook his head slowly and smiled. They had entered the oldest section of Mos Eisley, and consequently the one where the old vices flourished most strongly. Kenobi pointed, and Luke pulled the land speeder up in front of one of the spaceport's first blockhouses. It had been converted into a cantina. Luke said, "I still can't understand how we got by those troops. I thought we were as good as dead." "The Force is in the mind, Luke, and can sometimes be used to influence others. It's a powerful ally, but you will discover that it can also be a danger." Nodding without really understanding, Luke indicated the cantina. "Do you really think we can find a pilot here capable of taking us all the way to Alderaan?" Kenobi was exiting the speeder. "Most of the good independent freighter pilots frequent this place, though many can afford better. They can talk freely here. Watch yourself, though. This place can be rough." Moving inward, Luke was astonished at the variety of beings making use of the bar. Tentacles, claws, and hands were wrapped around drinking utensils of various sizes and shapes. Conversation was a steady babble of human and alien tongues. Leaning close, Kenobi gestured toward the far end of the bar. A small knot of rough-looking humans lounged there, drinking and laughing. Corellians. Pirates, most likely. Wait here. Luke nodded and watched as Kenobi worked his way through the crowd. Suddenly, something shoved Luke roughly from behind. He turned angrily, but his fury spent itself in astonishment. He found himself confronted by a large, squarish monstrosity of multiple eyes and indeterminate origin. The apparition bubbled challengingly. Luke had never seen its like before. He knew neither its species nor its language. Not knowing what else to do, Luke tried studiously ignoring the creature. As he did so, a thing, a cross between a capybara and a small baboon, bounced over to squat next to the quivering Many-Eye. A short, grubby-looking human also approached.
He doesn't like you,
the stubby human informed Luke. Oh, I'm sorry about that, Luke admitted.
I don't like you either,
the little man went on. I said I was sorry about it.
Sorry?
The human mimicked derisively.
You better watch yourself. We're all wanted.
He indicated his drunken companions.
I have the death sentence on me and 12 systems.
I'll be careful, Luke muttered.
You'll be dead.
This little one isn't worth the trouble, a calm voice said. Luke looked up, startled. He hadn't heard Kenobi come up alongside him. Come, let me buy you all something. The bulky monster chittered hideously and swung out a massive limb. It caught Luke across the temple and sent him spinning across the room, crashing through tables and shattering a large jug filled with a foul-smelling liquid. The drunken monstrosity pulled a wicked-looking pistol from its service pouch. The old man's hand moved to the disc slung at his side. The short human started to yell as a fiery blue-white light appeared in the dimness of the cantina. He never finished the yell. It turned into a blink. When the blink was finished, the man found himself lying prone against the bar, moaning and whimpering as he stared at the stump of an arm. In between the start of his yell and the conclusion of the blink, the rodent thing had been cleft cleanly down the middle, its two halves falling in opposite directions. The giant multi-ocular creature still stood staring, gazed at the old human who was poised motionless before it, the shining lightsaber held over his head in a peculiar fashion. The creature's chrome pistol fired once, blowing a hole in the door. Then the torso peeled away neatly, its two cauterized sections falling to lie motionless on the cool stone. Bringing the lightsaber down, Kenobi flipped it carefully upward in a reflex saluting motion, which ended with the deactivated weapon resting on his hip. That final movement broke the total quiet which had enshrouded the room. Conversation resumed. The bartender and several assistants appeared to drag the unsightly corpses out of the room, while the mutilated human vanished wordlessly into the crowd, cradling the stump of his gun arm and counting himself fortunate. You're hurt, Luke. Luke felt the bruise where the big creature had struck him. He started to say, but old Ben cut him off. As if nothing had happened, he indicated the great hairy mass which was shouldering its way through the crowd toward them. Luke had heard about Wookiees, but he had never expected to see one. Despite an almost comical quasi-monkey face, the Wookiee was anything but gentle-looking. Only the large, glowing yellow eyes softened its otherwise awesome appearance. The massive torso was covered entirely with soft, thick, russet fur. This is Chewbacca. He's the first mate on a ship that might suit our needs. He'll take us to her Captain Ona now. In a rear booth, they encountered a sharp-featured man, perhaps 5 years older than Luke, perhaps a dozen. It was difficult to tell. He displayed the openness of the utterly confident or the insanely reckless.
I'm Han Solo, captain of the Millennium Falcon. Chewie tells me you're looking for passage to the Alderaan system?
That's right, son. If it's a fast ship, Kenobi told him.
Fast ship? You mean you've never heard of the Millennium Falcon?
Kenobi appeared amused. Should I?
It's the ship that made the Kessel run in less than 12 standard time parts. I think she's fast enough for you, old man.
His outrage subsided rapidly.
What's your cargo?
Myself, the boy, 2 droids, and no questions asked.
No questions, Solo said. Is it local trouble?
Let's just say we'd like to avoid any Imperial entanglements.
Well, that can be a real trick. It'll cost you a little extra. All in all, about 10,000 in advance.
Luke gaped at the pilot.
10,000? Oh, we could almost buy our own ship for that.
Solo shrugged.
Well, maybe you could and maybe you couldn't. In any case, could you fly it? Well, you bet I could, Luke shot back. I'm not such a bad pilot myself.
We haven't that much with us, Kenobi explained. But we could pay you 2,000 now, plus another 15 when we reach Alderaan. Solo leaned forward.
15? You can really get your hands on that kind of money?
I promise it. From the government on Alderaan itself.
17,000. All right, you got yourselves a ship. As for avoiding Imperial entanglements, you'd better twist out of here, or even the Millennium Falcon won't be any help to you.
He nodded toward the cantina entrance and added quickly, Docking Bay 94. 4 Imperial troopers had entered the cantina. Moving to the bar, the officer in charge asked the bartender a couple of brief questions. The man hesitated a moment, then pointed toward the back of the room. As he did so, his eyes widened slightly. The booth he was pointing to was empty. From their vantage point in another booth, Solo grinned.
Chewie, this charter could save our necks. 17,000. He shook his head in amazement. Those two must really be desperate. I wonder what they're wanted for. But I agreed, no questions. Well, they're paying enough for it. Let's get going. The Falcon won't check itself out.
Going somewhere, Solo?
The creature was roughly man-sized and bipedal. It had huge, dull-faceted eyes, bulbous on a pea-green face. A ridge of short spines crested the high skull, while nostrils and mouth were contained in a taper-like snout.
As a matter of fact, Greedo, Solo replied slowly, I was just on my way to see your boss. You can tell Jabba I've got the money I owe him.
That's what you said yesterday and last week. It's too late, Solo.
But I've really got the money this time, Solo protested.
Fine. I'll take it now, please.
Solo sat down slowly. Jabba's minions were apt to be cursed with nervous trigger fingers. The alien took the seat across from him, the muzzle of the ugly little pistol never straying from Solo's chest.
I haven't got it here with me. Tell Jabba...
It's too late, I think. Jabba would rather have your ship.
Over my dead body, Solo said unamiably.
If you insist.
Something which might have been a laugh came from the creature's translator.
I've been looking forward to this for a long time. You've embarrassed me with your excuses for the last time.
I think you're right.
Light and noise filled the little corner of the cantina. When it had faded, all that remained of the unctuous alien was a smoking, slimy spot on the stone floor. Solo brought his hand and the smoking weapon it held out from beneath the table, drawing bemused stares from the cantina's more knowledgeable patrons. They had known the creature had committed its fatal mistake in allowing Solo to get his hands under cover. Leaving the booth, Solo flipped the bartender a handful of coins,
as he and Chewbacca moved off. "Sorry for the mess." The pit which formed Docking Bay 94 was as shabbily cut and run down as the majority of Mos Eisley. Luke felt it formed the perfect setting for the spacecraft within. That battered ellipsoid, which could only loosely be labeled a ship, appeared to have been pieced together out of old hull fragments and components discarded as unusable by other craft. The wonder of it, Luke mused, was that the thing actually held its shape. "What a piece of junk," Luke murmured. Either Solo had supernaturally acute hearing, or else he was used to the reaction the Millennium Falcon produced in prospective passengers. "Well, she may not look like much," he confessed as he approached them, "but she's all go. I've added a few unique modifications to her myself. She'll make .5 beyond light speed." Luke scratched his head. Either the Corellian was the biggest liar this side of the galactic center, or there was more to this vessel than met the eye. Chewbacca had lingered behind at the docking bay entrance. Now he rushed up the ramp, a hairy whirlwind, and blabbered excitedly at Solo. The pilot barked a brief reply. The Wookiee charged into the ship, pausing only to urge everyone to follow. "We seem to be a bit rushed," Solo explained cryptically. "So if you'll hurry aboard, we'll be off." Luke was about to venture some questions, but Kenobi was already prodding him up the ramp. The droids followed. Inside, Luke was slightly startled to see the bulky Chewbacca squirm his way into a pilot's chair, which was overwhelmed by his massive form. The Wookiee flipped several tiny switches with digits seemingly too big for the task. Those great paws drifted with surprising grace over the controls. A deep throbbing started somewhere within the ship as the engines were activated. Luke and Ben began strapping themselves into the vacant seats in the main passageway. A glint of light on moving metal caught Solo's eyes as the first troops showed themselves. Solo thought it unlikely they would pause to engage in casual conversation. His suspicion was confirmed as several dropped to their knees and opened fire on him. Solo ducked back inside, turning to yell forward. "Chewie! Deflector shields, quick! Get us out of here!" A throaty roar of acknowledgement came back to him. Drawing his own pistol, Solo managed to snap off a couple of bursts from the comparative safety of the hatchway. The exposed troops dove for cover. The low throbbing rose to a whine, then to a deafening howl, as Solo's hand came down on the quick-release button. Immediately, the overhead hatch cover slammed shut. All across Mos Eisley, alarms began to sound, spreading out from Docking Bay 94 in concentric circles of concern. Several soldiers scouring one alleyway reacted to the citywide alarm at the same time as they saw the small freighter lift gracefully into the clear blue sky above Mos Eisley. It shrank to a pinpoint before any of them thought to bring a weapon to bear. Luke and Ben were already undoing their acceleration straps as Solo walked past them, moving toward the cockpit with the easy stride of the experienced spacer. Once forward, he fell into the pilot's seat and immediately began checking readouts and gauges. In the seat next to him, Chewbacca was growling and grunting like a poorly tuned speeder engine. He turned from studying his own instruments long enough to jab a massive finger at the tracking screen. Solo gave it a quick glance, then turned irritably to his own panel. I know. Looks like 2 destroyers. Sure picked ourselves a hot one this time. Try to hold them off somehow until I can finish the programming for the super-light jump. Angle the deflectors for maximum shielding." Rear scanners showed the baleful lemon eye of Tatooine shrinking rapidly behind them. It wasn't rapid enough to eliminate the 3 points of light that indicated the presence of the pursuing Imperial warships. Solo turned to acknowledge the entrance of Luke and Ben. "We've got 2 more coming in from different angles," he told them. "They're going to try to box us up before we can jump." "Can't you outrun them?" Luke asked sarcastically. "I thought you said this thing was fast." "Watch your mouth, kid, or you'll find yourself floating home. We'll be safe enough once we've made the jump into hyperspace." He grinned knowingly. Plus, I know a few tricks that ought to lose any persistent stick-tights. Luke had a retort poised on his lips. It was wiped out as he threw up his arms to ward off a brilliant red flash. "Here's where the situation gets interesting," Solo muttered. "How long before you can make the jump?" Kenobi inquired easily. "Well, we're still within the gravitational influence of Tatooine," came the cool response. "It'll be a few minutes yet before the navigation computer can compensate and effect an accurate jump." "A few minutes?" Luke blurted, staring at the screens. "Well, at the rate they're gaining. Traveling through hyperspace isn't like dusting crops, boy. Ever tried calculating a hyperspace jump?" Luke had to shake his head. "Be nice if we rushed it and passed right through a star or a black hole. That would end our trip real quick." Fresh explosions continued to flare close by despite Chewbacca's best efforts at evasion. On Solo's console, a red warning light began to flash. "What's that?" Luke wondered nervously. "We're losing a deflector shield," Solo informed him. "Better strap yourselves back in. We're almost ready to make the jump." Back in the main hold area, 3PO was already locked tightly to his seat by metal arms stronger than any acceleration straps. R2 swayed back and forth under the concussion produced by the increasingly powerful energy bursts against the ship's deflectors. Suddenly, an immensely powerful something wrenched at the ship's hull with the strength of a fallen angel. Admiral Motti entered the conference room, his face streaked by the linear lights lining the walls. Governor Tarkin stood before the curved view screen where a small green gem of a world was pictured. Motti announced, "We have entered the Alderaan system. We await your order." Tarkin made a gesture to the Admiral. "Wait a moment yet, Motti." A door slid aside, and Leia Organa entered, flanked by 2 armed guards, followed by Darth Vader. "Governor Tarkin," she spat, "I should have expected to find you holding Vader's leash. I thought I recognized your unique stench when I was first brought on board." "Charming to the last," Tarkin declared. "You don't know how hard I found it to sign the order for your termination." "I'm surprised you had the courage to issue the order yourself." Tarkin sighed reluctantly. "I am a dedicated man, and the pleasures I reserve for myself are few. One of them is that before your execution, I should like you to be my guest at a small ceremony. It will certify this battle station's operational status, while at the same time ushering in a new era of Imperial technical supremacy." Leia looked at him with contempt. "Force will not keep the Empire together. The more you tighten your grip, the more systems will slip through your fingers." Tarkin smiled a death's head smile. "Before you leave us, we must demonstrate the power of this station once and for all. Since you have proven reluctant to supply us with the location of the rebel stronghold, I have selected as an alternate subject your home planet of Alderaan." "No, you can't. Alderaan is a peaceful world. You can't." Tarkin's eyes gleamed. "You would prefer another target? A military target? For the last time, where is the rebel base?" "Dantooine," she whispered, all pretense of defiance gone now. "They're on Dantooine." Tarkin let out a sigh of satisfaction. "There. You see, Lord Vader? She can be reasonable." He directed his attention to the other officers. "You may proceed with the operation, gentlemen." "What?" Organa finally gasped. "Dantooine," Tarkin explained, "is too far from the centers of Imperial population to serve as the subject of an effective demonstration. Have no fear, though.
We will deal with your rebel friends as soon as possible. He gestured to the two soldiers flanking her. Escort her to the principal observation level, and, he smiled, make certain she is provided with an unobstructed view. Solo was busily checking readouts from gauges and dials in the hold area.
You can stop worrying about your Imperial friends, he told Luke and Ben. They'll never be able to track us now. Told you I'd lose them.
Kenobi might have nodded briefly in response, but he was engaged in explaining something to Luke. Luke stood frozen in the middle of the hold. He held an activated lightsaber in position over his head. A low hum came from the ancient instrument, while Luke lunged and parried under Ben Kenobi's instructive gaze. No, Luke. Your cuts should flow, not be so choppy, Kenobi instructed. Remember, the Force is omnipresent. It envelops you as it radiates from you. A Jedi warrior can actually feel the Force as a physical thing. Is it an energy field, then? Luke inquired. It is an energy field, and something more, Kenobi went on, almost mystically. An aura that it once controls and obeys. It is a nothingness that can accomplish miracles. The old man hefted a silvery globe about the size of a man's fist. It was covered with antennae, as delicate as those of a moth. He flipped it toward Luke and watched as it halted a couple of meters away from the boy's face. Luke readied himself as the ball circled him slowly. Abruptly, it executed a lightning-swift lunge. A thin pencil of red light jumped from one of the antennae to the back of Luke's thigh. Rubbing at his tingling leg, Luke tried to ignore the burst of accusing laughter from Solo.
Ha! Hocus-pocus religions and archaic weapons are no substitute for a good blaster at your side.
You don't believe in the Force? Asked Luke.
I've been from one end of this galaxy to the other, the pilot boasted, and I've seen a lot of strange things. Too many to think that there could be some such controlling one's actions. I determine my destiny, not some half-mystical energy field.
Kenobi only smiled gently. I suggest you try it again, Luke. You must try to divorce your actions from conscious control. Only then can you use the Force. Relax. Stop thinking. Let yourself drift. Free. Free. The old man's voice had dropped to a mesmerizing buzz. As he finished, the chrome bulb darted at Luke. Dazed by Kenobi's hypnotic tone, Luke didn't see it charge. But as the ball neared, he whirled with amazing speed, the saber arcing up and out in a peculiar fashion. The red beam that the globe emitted was neatly deflected to one side. Its humming stopped, and the ball bounced to the deck, all animation gone. Blinking as if coming awake from a short nap, Luke stared in absolute astonishment at the inert remote.
You see, you can do it. Now, you must learn to admit the Force when you want it, so that you can learn to control it consciously.
Moving to one side, Kenobi took a large helmet from a locker and walked over to Luke. Placing the helmet over his head effectively eliminated the boy's vision. I can't see, Luke muttered. How can I fight? With the Force, you didn't really see the Seeker last time, and yet you parried its beam. Try to let that sensation flow within you again. I can't do it, Luke moaned. I'll get hit again. Not if you let yourself trust you. This is the only way to be certain you're relying wholly on the Force. Bending over the chrome globe, he touched a control at its side. Then he tossed it straight up. Breaking in mid-fall, the ball plummeted stone-like toward the deck. Luke swung the saber at it.
While it was a commendable try, it wasn't nearly fast enough. Once again, the little antennae glowed. This time, the crimson needle hit Luke square on the seat of his pants.
Relax,
Old Ben urged him.
be free. You're trying to use your eyes and ears. Use the rest of your mind.
Suddenly, the youth stopped, wavering slightly. The seeker was still behind him. Changing direction again, it made another dive and fired. Simultaneously, the lightsaber jerked around to deflect the bolt. This time, the ball didn't fall motionless to the deck. Instead, it backed up 3 meters and remained there, hovering.
I told you you could,
Kenobi informed him with pleasure.
Once you start to trust your inner self, there'll be no stopping you. I told you there was much of your father in you.
Solo informed his passengers. We're coming up on Alderaan. We'll be slowing down shortly and going back under light speed. The Wookiee turned something on the console before him. At the same time, Solo pulled back on a comparatively large lever. Abruptly, the long streaks of Doppler-distorted starlight slowed to hyphen shapes, then finally to familiar bolts of fire. Gigantic chunks of glowing stone appeared out of the nothingness, barely shunted aside by the ship's deflectors. The strain caused the Millennium Falcon to shudder violently. "What the?" a thoroughly startled Solo muttered. Luke fought to keep his balance as he made his way into the cockpit. "What's going on?" "We're back in normal space," Solo informed him. "But we've come out in the middle of the worst asteroid storm I've ever seen. It's not on any of our charts." He peered hard at several indicators. "According to the Galactic Atlas, our position is correct. Only one thing is missing. Alderaan." "Missing? But that's crazy." "I won't argue with you," the Corellian replied grimly, "but there's nothing out there. Nothing but debris." He paused. "Judging from the amount of solid waste, I'd guess that Alderaan's been blown away." "Destroyed," Luke whispered, overwhelmed at the specter raised by such an unimaginable disaster. "But how?"
"The Empire," a voice declared firmly. Ben Kenobi had come in behind Luke.
"No." Solo was shaking his head slowly. "No. The entire Imperial fleet couldn't have done this." "I wonder if we should get out of here," Luke was murmuring. "If it was the Empire..." "I don't know what's happened here," an angry Solo cursed, "but I'll tell you one thing. The Empire isn't..." Muffled alarms began humming loudly. "Another ship," Solo announced. "Can't judge the type yet." Ben Kenobi's next words shattered more than that hope.
"That's an Imperial fighter."
Chewbacca suddenly gave an angry bark. A huge flower of destruction blossomed outside the port, battering the freighter violently. A tiny double-winged ball raced past the cockpit. "It's leaving in a big hurry," Luke noted. "If it identifies us, we're in big trouble." "Not if I can help it," Solo declared. "Chewie, jam its transmission. Lay in a pursuit course." At first, the Imperial fighter tried a complex evasive course, to no avail. Seeing that he couldn't shake his pursuers, the fighter pilot opened up his tiny engine all the way. Ahead, one of the multitude of stars was becoming steadily brighter. It assumed a circular outline. "He's heading for that small moon," Luke murmured. "The Empire must have an outpost there," Solo admitted. "But I think I can get him." They drew steadily nearer. Gradually, craters and mountains of the moon became visible. Yet, there was something extremely odd about them.
"That's no moon," Kenobi breathed softly. "That's a space station."
"It's too big to be a space station," Solo objected. "I have a very strange feeling about this," was Luke's comment. Abruptly, the usually calm Kenobi was shouting, "Turn the ship around! Let's get out of here!" "Yes, I think you're right, old man. Full reverse, Chewie."
The Wookiee started adjusting controls, and the freighter arced around in a broad curve. The tiny fighter leaped instantly toward the monstrous station until it was swallowed up by its overpowering bulk. Gauges began to whine in protest. Try as he might, Solo couldn't keep the surface of the gargantuan station from looming steadily larger until it became the heavens. "We're caught in a tractor beam. It's dragging us in," the pilot muttered. "But they're not going to suck me up like so much dust without a fight." He started to vacate the pilot's chair, but was restrained by an aged yet powerful hand on his shoulder. "There are always alternatives to fighting." Vader stared at the stars displayed on the conference room map, while Tarkin and Admiral Motti conferred nearby. Interestingly, the first use of the most powerful destructive machine ever constructed had seemingly had no influence at all on that map. Tarkin turned as an Imperial officer entered the chamber. "Yes? What is it?" "Governor, the advanced scouts have reached Dantooine. They have found the remains of a rebel base, which they estimate has been deserted for some time. Years, possibly." Tarkin's face darkened. "She lied to us." Vader must have smiled behind his mask. "I told you she would never betray the rebellion." A voice reported over an unseen speaker. "Sirs, we've captured a small freighter that was entering the remains of Alderaan. Its markings match that of the ship which blasted its way out of Mos Eisley, Tatooine system." Tarkin looked puzzled. "Mos Eisley? Tatooine? What's this all about, Vader?" "It means, Tarkin, that the last of our unresolved difficulties is about to be eliminated. Someone apparently received the missing data tapes and was trying to return them to her." Tarkin nodded in understanding. "How convenient. I leave this matter in your hands, Vader." The Dark Lord bowed slightly. Then he spun and strode from the room. The freighter sat listlessly in the docking hangar of the huge bay. "Empty," the sergeant in charge finally declared in surprise. He turned and called down to Vader. "There is no one aboard. According to the ship's log, her crew abandoned ship immediately after liftoff, then set her on automatics for Alderaan. Possibly a decoy," the officer ventured aloud. "Then they should still be on Tatooine." "Possibly," Vader admitted reluctantly. "Several of the escape pods have been jettisoned," the officer went on. Vader hesitated before replying. "This doesn't feel right. Send a fully equipped scanning team on board. I want every centimeter of that ship checked out." With that, he whirled and stalked from the hangar, pursued by the infuriating feeling that he was overlooking something of vital importance. The rest of the assembled soldiers were dismissed by the officer. On board the freighter, a last lone figure left off examining the space beneath the cockpit consoles and ran to join his comrades. Below, the muffled sounds of the officer giving final orders faded, leaving the interior in complete quiet. The quivering of a portion of the floor was the only movement on board. Abruptly, the quivering became a sharp upheaval. 2 metal panels popped upward, followed by a pair of tousled heads. "Lucky you built these compartments," Luke commented. "Where did you think I kept smuggled goods? I admit I never expected to smuggle myself in them. This is ridiculous. It isn't going to work. Even if I could take off and get past the closed hatch," he jabbed a thumb upward, "we'd never get past that tractor beam." Another panel opened, revealing the face of an elderly imp. "You leave that to me." "I was afraid you'd say something like that," muttered Solo. 2 technicians had arrived at the base of the ramp. They reported to the 2 bored soldiers guarding it.
"The ship's all yours," one of the troopers told them. The men nodded, then strained to lug their heavy equipment up the ramp. As soon as they disappeared inside, a loud crash was heard. Both guards whirled, then heard a voice call, "Hey, down there! Could you give us a hand?" One trooper looked at his companion, who shrugged. They both started up the ramp. A second crashing sound reverberated, but now there was no one left to hear it. A gantry officer, passing the window of a small command office near the freighter entrance, glanced out, frowning when he saw no sign of the guards. "THX, 1138, why aren't you at your post?" The speaker gave back only static. "THX, 1138, why don't you reply?" An armored figure descended the ramp and waved toward him, pointing to the portion of his helmet covering his right ear. The gantry officer gave his busy aide an annoyed look as he made for the door. We've got another bad transmitter. I'm going to see what I can do." He activated the door, took a step forward as it slid aside, and stumbled backward in a state of shock. Filling the door completely, Chewbacca leaned inward and with a bone-splintering howl flattened the benumbed officer with one swipe of a pan-sized fist. The aide was reaching for his sidearm when a narrow energy beam passed completely through him, piercing his heart. Solo flipped up the faceplate of his trooper helmet as he followed the Wookiee into the room. Kenobi and the droids squeezed in behind him, with Luke, also clad in Imperial armor, bringing up the rear. Luke was looking around nervously as he shut the door behind them. They watched as Kenobi operated an incredibly complex computer console with the ease and confidence of one long accustomed to handling intricate machinery. A screen lit up promptly with a map of sections of the battle station. The old man leaned forward, scrutinizing the display carefully. Meanwhile, 3PO and R2 had been going over an equally complicated control panel nearby. R2 suddenly froze and began whistling wildly at something he had found.
"Plug him in," Kenobi suggested. "He should be able to draw information from the entire station network. Let's see if he can find out where the tractor beam power unit is located."
R2 punched a claw arm into the open computer socket he had discovered. Immediately, a galaxy of lights came to life on the panel in front of him. Then the hum slowed, and he turned to beep something back at them.
"He's found it, sir,"
3PO announced excitedly. Kenobi turned his attention to a small readout near R2. Data began to race across it too fast for Luke to see, but Kenobi somehow made something of the schematic blur.
"I don't think there's any way you boys can help with this."
"Well, that suits me fine," said Solo readily. "I've already done more than I bargained for on this trip."
Luke wasn't put off so easily. "I want to go with you."
"Don't be impatient, Luke. This requires skills you haven't yet mastered. Stay and watch over the droids. They must be delivered to the rebel forces, or many more worlds will meet the same fate as Alderaan. Trust in the Force, Luke, and wait."
Stepping to the door, he slid it aside and disappeared down a long, glowing hallway. As soon as he was gone, a hysterical whistling and hooting came from the computer console. Luke hurried over to R2-D2. "What now?" Luke asked 3PO. The taller robot looked puzzled himself. "I'm afraid I don't understand either, sir. He says, 'I found her,' and keeps repeating, 'She's here, she's here.'" "Who? Who is he found?" "Princess Leia," 3PO announced. "I believe she may be the person in the message he was carrying." "The princess? She's here? Where?" Luke demanded breathlessly. R2 whistled on while 3PO translated. "Level 5, detention block AA-23. She's scheduled for slow termination." "No, we've got to do something."
"What are you three blabbering about?" Solo demanded.
"She's the one who programmed the message into R2-D2, Luke explained hurriedly. "We've got to help her."
"Now, just a minute," Solo cautioned him. "The old man said to wait here."
"But Ben didn't know she was here," Luke argued. Anxiety turned to thoughtfulness. And now, if we could just figure out a way to get into that detention block. Solo shook his head and stepped back.
I'm not going into any Imperial detention blocks.
But they're going to execute her.
Better her than me.
I've seen her, Luke persisted desperately. She's beautiful.
So's life.
She's rich.
Rich?
The reward could be more wealth than you can imagine.
I don't know. I can imagine quite a bit. All right, we'll give it a try. But you'd better be right about that reward. What's your plan, kid?
They reached a wide bank of elevators. After what felt like hours, the door opened and they stepped out into the security area. A tall, grim-looking officer approached them. He frowned as he examined the silent Chewbacca.
Where are you two going with this thing?
Luke found himself replying almost instinctively. Prisoner transfer from Block TS-138. The officer looked puzzled.
I wasn't notified. I'll have to clear it.
Turning, the man walked to a small console nearby and began entering his request. Solo nodded to Luke as he unfastened Chewbacca's cuffs. Then he whispered something to the Wookiee. An ear-splitting howl shook the corridor as Chewbacca threw up both hands, grabbing Solo's rifle from him.
Look out! Solo shouted. It's loose! It'll rip us all apart!
Both he and Luke had darted clear of the rampaging Wookiee, pulled out their pistols, and were blasting away at him. Not a single shot came close enough to the dodging Wookiee. Instead, they blasted automatic cameras, energy gate controls, and the three dumbfounded guards. Solo rushed to the open comlink speaker, which was screeching anxious questions about what was going on. Ignoring the barrage of threats and queries, he checked the readout set in the panel nearby.
This princess of yours is in cell 2187.
Luke nodded once and was racing down the narrow walkway. He found cell 2187 just as he was about to give up. Turning his pistol to maximum and hoping it wouldn't melt in his hand before it broke through, he opened fire. The door was blasted open. Peering through the smoke with an uncomprehending look on her face was the young woman whose portrait R2-D2 had projected in a garage on Tatooine. Her look of confusion was replaced by impatience. "Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper?" "What?" "Oh, the uniform." He removed the helmet. "I've come to rescue you. I'm Luke Skywalker." "I beg your pardon," she said politely. "I said, I've come to rescue you. Ben Kenobi is with me. We've got your two droids. Ben Kenobi." She looked around Luke, ignoring him as she searched for the Jedi. "Where is he?" Governor Tarkin watched as Darth Vader paced rapidly back and forth in the otherwise empty conference room. Finally, the Dark Lord paused. "He is here," Vader stated. Tarkin looked startled. "Obi-Wan Kenobi, that's impossible. What makes you think so?"
"A stirring in the Force, of a kind I've only felt in the presence of my old master."
"Well, surely he must be dead by now." Vader hesitated.
"Perhaps. The sensation is gone now."
"The Jedi are extinct," declared Tarkin. "You, my friend, are all that's left of their ways." A comlink buzzed softly for attention. "Yes," Tarkin acknowledged. "We have an emergency alert in detention block AA-23. "The princess," Tarkin yelped. Vader whirled, trying to stare through the walls.
"I knew it. Obi-Wan is here."
"Put all sections on alert," Tarkin ordered. "If you're right, he must not be allowed to escape."
"Escape may not be Obi-Wan Kenobi's intention. The danger he presents to us must not be underestimated. Yet only I can deal with him."
His head snapped around to stare fixedly at Tarkin.
"Alone.
Luke and Leia had started back up the corridor when a series of blinding explosions ripped the walkway ahead of them. Several troopers had tried coming through the elevator, only to be crisped by Chewbacca. Disdaining the elevators, they had blasted a gaping hole through a wall. Retreating down the walkway, Han and Chewbacca encountered Luke and the princess.
"We can't go back that way," Solo told them.
"No, it looks like you've managed to cut off our only escape route," Leia agreed readily. "This is a detention area, you know. They don't build them with multiple exits." Breathing heavily, Solo turned to look her up and down.
"Begging your forgiveness, Your Highness," he said sarcastically. "But maybe you'd prefer it back in your cell."
Back in the gantry office, R2-D2 beeped and whistled frantically as someone began banging on the locked door. "Oh, no," 3PO groaned. The smoke in the corridor was now so intense that it was difficult for Solo and Chewbacca to pick their targets. That was fortunate inasmuch as the smoke confused the Imperial's fire with equal thoroughness. Energy bolts continued to ricochet wildly through the block as Luke moved close to Solo. "Well, they're closing in on us. What do we do now?" "This is some rescue," an irritated voice complained from behind them. Both men turned to see a thoroughly disgusted princess eyeing them with regal disapproval. "When you came in here, didn't you have a plan for getting out?" Solo nodded toward Luke.
"He's the brains, sweetheart."
Luke managed an embarrassed grin and shrugged helplessly. The princess had snatched the pistol from his hand. "Hey!" Luke stared as she moved along the wall, finally locating a small grate nearby. She pointed the pistol at it and fired. Solo gazed at her in disbelief.
"What do you think you're doing?"
"It looks like it's up to me to save our skins. Into that garbage chute, flyboy." While the others looked on in amazement, she jumped feet first into the opening and disappeared. Chewbacca rumbled threateningly. Solo yelled,
"Go on in, you furry oaf. I don't care what you smell."
Shoving the reluctant Wookiee toward the tiny opening, Solo helped jam the massive bulk through. As soon as he disappeared, the Corellian followed him in. Luke fired off a last series of blasts, slid into the chute, and was gone. The chamber Luke tumbled into was dimly lit. He smelled the decay long before he was dumped into it. Unadorned except for the concealed illuminants, the garbage room was at least a quarter full of slimy muck. Solo was stumbling around the room, sinking up to his knees in the uncertain footing in an attempt to locate an exit. All he found was a small, thick hatchway that refused to budge.
"It won't take long for them to figure out what happened to us. We had things well under control until you let us down here."
"Sure you did," she shot back, brushing refuse from her hair. "Oh, well, it could be worse." As if in reply, a piercing, horrible moan filled the room.
"What was that?"
Solo asked. "I'm not too sure." Luke suddenly jumped. "Something just moved past me, I think. Watch out." With shocking suddenness, Luke disappeared straight down into the garbage. "It's got Luke!" the princess shouted. As abruptly as he had vanished, Luke reappeared. A thick, whitish tentacle was wrapped tight around his throat. "Shoot it! Kill it!" Luke screamed.
"Shoot it? I can't even see it,"
Solo protested. Once again, Luke was sucked under by whatever that gruesome appendage was attached to. Solo stared helplessly around the multicolored surface. Suddenly, there was a distant rumbling of heavy machinery, and two opposing walls of the chamber moved inward several centimeters. The rumbling ceased, and then it was quiet again. Luke appeared unexpectedly close to Solo, scrambling his way clear of the suffocating mess and rubbing at the welt on his neck. "What happened to it?" Leia wondered. Luke looked genuinely puzzled. "I don't know. It just let me go and disappeared."
"I've got a very bad feeling about this," Solo murmured.
Again, the distant rumble filled the room. Again, the walls began their inward march, only this time They didn't show any sign of stopping. "Don't just stand there gaping," the princess urged them. "Try to brace them with something." Even with the thick metal beams Chewbacca could handle, they were unable to find anything capable of slowing the wall's advance. Luke pulled out his comlink. "3PO! Come in, 3PO!" A pause produced no response. "C-3PO!" the muted voice continued to call. "Come in, C-3PO!" It was Luke's voice, and it issued softly in between buzzings from the small hand comlink resting on the deserted computer console. A tremendous explosion drowned out the muffled pleadings. It blew the office door clean across the room, sending metal fragments flying in all directions. 4 armed troopers entered through the blown portal. Initial study indicated the office was deserted, until a dim, frightened voice was heard coming from one of the tall supply cabinets near the back of the room. "Help! Help! Let us out!" Several of the troopers opened the noisy cabinet. 2 robots, one tall and humanoid, the other purely mechanical, stepped out. "They're madmen, I tell you, madmen!" 3PO gestured urgently toward the doorway. "They said something about heading for the prison level." 2 of the troopers inside joined those waiting in the hallway and hustling off down the corridor. That left 2 guards to watch over the office. They totally ignored the robots as they discussed what might have taken place. "All the excitement has overloaded the circuitry in my companion here," 3PO explained carefully. If you don't mind, I'd like to take him down to maintenance." One of the guards nodded indifferently to the robot. 3PO and R2 hurried out the door without looking back. "Oh, that was too close," 3PO muttered as they scurried down an empty corridor. "Now we'll have to find another information control console and plug you back in, or everything is lost." The service bay was unoccupied, everyone apparently having been drawn away by the commotion elsewhere. Together, they commenced a hurried search of the many service panels. R2 let out a beep, and 3PO rushed to him. A flurry of electronics spewed from the little droid. 3PO cried, "They're where? They what? Oh, no! They'll come out of there as a liquid!" Less than a meter of life was left to the trapped occupants of the garbage room. Leia and Solo had been forced to turn sideways, had ended up facing each other. For the first time, the haughtiness was gone from the princess's face. She took Solo's hand, clutching it, as she felt the first touch of the closing walls. Luke had fallen and was lying on his side, fighting to keep his head above the rising ooze. He nearly choked on a mouthful of compressed sludge when his comlink began buzzing for attention. 3PO, "Are you there, sir?" the droid replied. "We've had some minor problems. You would not believe—" "Shut up, 3PO, Luke screamed, "and shut down all the refuse units on the detention level. Do you copy? Shut down the refuse." Moments later, 3PO grabbed at his head in pain as a terrific screeching and yelling sounded over the comlink. The yelling, however, continued far beyond what seemed like a reasonable interval. In fact, they were shouts of relief. The chamber walls had reversed direction automatically with R2's shutdown and were moving apart again. "R2, 3PO, Luke hollered into the comlink. "It's all right. We're all right." He made his way toward the hatch cover. "Open the pressure maintenance hatch on Unit 366-117891. "Yes, sir," came 3PO's acknowledgement. They may have been the happiest words Luke had ever heard. The narrow catwalk running around one side looked like a starched thread glued on a glowing ocean. It was barely wide enough for one man to traverse. One man edged his way along that treacherous walkway now, his gaze intent on something ahead of him instead of the awesome metal abyss below. 2 thick cables joined underneath an overlay panel. It was locked, but after careful inspection of sides, top and bottom, Ben Kenobi pressed the panel cover in a particular fashion, causing it to spring aside. A blinking computer terminal was revealed beneath. With equal care, he performed several adjustments to the terminal. His actions were rewarded when several indicator lights on the board changed from red to blue. Without warning, a door behind him opened. Reclosing the panel cover, the old man slipped deeper into the shadows. A detachment of troopers had appeared in the portal, and the officer in charge moved to within a couple of meters of the motionless, hidden figure.
Secure this area until the alert has been canceled.
As they began to disperse, Kenobi became one with the dark. Chewbacca grunted and wheezed, and barely succeeded in forcing his thick torso through the hatchway. That accomplished, Luke turned to take stock of their surroundings. The hallway they had emerged into showed dust on the floor. It gave the impression of not having been used since the station had been built. He had no idea where they were. Luke, Solo, Chewbacca, and the princess reached the end of an empty hallway. It dead-ended before a large window which overlooked a hangar, giving them a sweeping, tantalizing view of the freighter just below. Pulling out his comlink, Luke spoke into the pickup. "C-3PO, do you copy?" "I read you, sir. We had to abandon the region around the office." "Are you both safe?" "For the moment. We're in the main hangar, across from the ship." Luke looked toward the bay window in surprise. "I can't see you across the bay. We must be right above you. Stand by. We'll join you as soon as we can."
Wonder if the old man was able to knock out the tractor, Solo was muttering as he surveyed the scene below. A dozen or so troopers were moving in and out of the freighter.
Leia glanced from the ship to Solo. "You came here in that wreck? You're braver than I thought." Rounding a corner, humans and Wookiee came to an abrupt halt. So did the 20 Imperial troopers marching toward them. Reacting naturally, which is to say without thinking, Solo drew his pistol and charged the platoon, howling in several languages at the top of his lungs. Startled by the assault, and wrongly assuming their attacker knew what he was doing, the troopers started to back away. Several wild shots from the Corellian's pistol initiated complete panic. Ranks and composure shattered, the troopers broke and fled down the passage. "Are you out of your mind?" Luke yelled at him. "Where do you think you're going?" But Solo had already rounded a far bend in the corridor and didn't hear. Chewbacca let out a thunderous howl and rushed down the hallway after them. That left Luke and Leia standing alone in the empty corridor. "Maybe I was too hard on your friend," she confessed reluctantly. "He certainly is courageous." Luke countered. "I don't know what good it'll do us if he gets himself killed." Muted alarms suddenly sounded from the bay below and behind them. "That's done it," Luke growled disgustedly. "Let's go." Together they started off in search of a way down to the hangar deck level. Solo continued running at top speed down the long hallway, yelling and brandishing his pistol. The troopers he continued to harry still raced headlong away from him, returning his fire only indifferently. Then they came up against a dead end, which forced them to turn and confront their opponents. Seeing that the 10 had halted, Solo likewise slowed. It suddenly occurred to him that he was very much alone, and the same thought was beginning to seep into the minds of the troopers. Rifles and pistols started to come up. Solo took a step backward, fired one shot, then turned and ran like hell. Luke started down the corridor, motioning for Leia to follow. 2 guards appeared at the far end of the passageway, paused, and pointed directly at them. Turning, Luke and Leia began running back the way they had come. A larger squad of troopers rounded the far bend and came racing toward them. Blocked ahead and behind, they hunted frantically for another way out. Then Leia spotted a cramped sub-hallway and gestured to it. Luke fired at the nearest of their pursuers and joined her in running down the narrow passage. It looked like a minor service corridor. Behind them, pursuit sounded deafeningly loud in the confining space. A thick hatchway appeared ahead. The lighting beyond turned dimmer, raising Luke's hopes. If they could lock the hatch and lose themselves somewhere beyond, they might have a chance of shaking their tormentors. Luke was about to let out a shout of triumph when the ground suddenly vanished ahead of him. The catwalk had been reduced to a stub protruding into empty air. A cool draft caressed Luke's face as he studied walls that soared to unseen heights overhead and plunged to fathomless depths below. "I think we made a wrong turn," he murmured. An open hatchway showed on the other side of the chasm. It might as well have been a light year away. Hunting along the rim of the doorway, Leia located a switch and hit it quickly. The hatch door behind them slid shut with a resounding boom. "Well, this door won't hold them back very long." "We've got to get across there somehow," Leia agreed. "Find the controls for extending the bridge." Some desperate searching produced nothing, while an ominous pounding and hissing sounded from behind the frozen door. A small spot of white appeared in the center of the metal, then began to spread and smoke. "Oh, they're coming through," Luke groaned. The princess turned carefully to stare across the gap. This must be a single-unit bridge, with the controls only on the other side. Groping around, Luke's hand caught on something at his waist. The cable coiled on his belt was thin and fragile-seeming, but it would have supported Chewbacca's weight easily. Pulling the cable free of the waist catch, he gauged its length, matching it against the width of the abyss. This should span the distance with plenty to spare. "What now?" the princess inquired curiously. Luke didn't reply. Instead, he removed a small power unit from the utility belt of his armor and tied one end of the cable around it. Making sure the wrapping was secure, he stepped as close to the edge of their uncertain perch as he dared. Whirling the weighted end of the cord in increasing circles, he let it arc across the gorge. It struck an outcropping of cylindrical conduits on the other side and fell downward. With forced patience, he pulled the loose line back in, then recoiled it for another try. Once again, the weighted end orbited in ever greater circles, and again he flung it across the gap. This time, the heavy end looped around an outcropping of pipes above, wrapped itself several times around, and slipped battery end down into a crack between them. Wrapping the other end of the line several times around his waist, Luke reached out and pulled the princess close to him with the other. The hatch door behind them was now a molten white, and liquid metal was running steadily from its borders. Something warm and pleasant touched Luke's lips. He looked down in shock at the princess, his mouth still tingling from the kiss. "Just for luck," she murmured. Luke took a deep breath and jumped out into air. The heart-halting transit was accomplished in less time than that thought. In a moment, Luke was on the other side, scrambling on his knees to make sure they didn't fall back into the pit. Leia rolled forward into the open hatchway, climbing gracefully to her feet as Luke fought to untangle himself from the cable. A distant whine became a loud hiss, then a groan as the hatch door on the other side gave way. A few bolts struck the wall nearby. Luke returned the fire even as Leia was pulling him into the passageway behind. Once clear of the door, he hit the activating switch. It shut tightly behind them. They would have several minutes at least without having to worry about being shot in the back. On the other hand, Luke didn't have the slightest idea where they were, and he found himself wondering what had happened to Han and Chewbacca. Solo and his Wookiee partner had succeeded in shaking their pursuers. "Hurry, Chewie," Solo urged. The Wookiee growled something at him, but his partner fairly fluoresced with confidence. "Of course I can find the ship from here. Corellians can't get lost." There came another accusing growl. Solo shrugged. "Tenepal doesn't count. He wasn't a Corellian."
Besides, I was drunk.
Ben Kenobi ducked into the shadows of a narrow passageway, seeming to become part of the metal itself as a large cluster of troopers hurried past him. Just another 2 turns, and he should be at the hangar. Ben sensed something directly ahead and slowed cautiously. It had a most familiar feel to it, a half-remembered mental odor he could not quite place. Then the figure stepped out in front of him, blocking his entry to the hangar. Kenobi's hand moved naturally to the hilt of his deactivated saber.
I have been waiting a long time, Obi-Wan Kenobi,
Darth Vader intoned solemnly.
We meet again at last. The circle has been completed. You were once my teacher, and I learned much from you. But the time of learning has long passed, and I am the master now. Old man, you should never have come back. It will make your end less peaceful than you might have wished.
You sense only a part of the Force, Darth. As always, you perceive its reality as little as the utensil perceives the taste of food.
Kenobi lunged at the massive shape. Vader blocked the stab with equal speed, riposting with a counter-slash that Kenobi barely parried. Another parry, and Kenobi countered again, using this opportunity to move around the towering Dark Lord. They continued to trade blows, with the old man now backing towards the hangar. 3PO peeked around the entrance to the docking bay, worriedly counting the number of troopers milling around the deserted freighter. Where could they be? He ducked back out of sight, just as one of the guards glanced in his direction. A second, more cautious appraisal was more rewarding. It revealed Han Solo and Chewbacca hugging the wall of another tunnel on the far side of the bay. Solo also was nonplussed at the number of guards.
Didn't we just leave this party?
Chewbacca grunted, and both turned, only to relax at the sight of Luke and the princess.
What kept you?
Solo quipped mirthlessly. Luke was staring at the freighter. Is the ship all right?
Seems okay, was Solo's analysis. The problem's gonna be getting to it.
Leia suddenly pointed to one of the opposite tunnels. Look! Illuminated by the flare from contacting energy fields, Ben Kenobi and Darth Vader were backing toward the bay. The fight attracted the attention of others beside the senator. Every one of the guards moved in for a better view of the Olympian conflict.
Now's our chance, Solo observed, starting forward.
All 7 of the troopers guarding the ship broke and rushed toward the combatants. 3PO barely ducked aside as they ran past him. Unplug yourself, R2. We're leaving. The 2 droids began to edge out into the open bay. Kenobi heard the approaching commotion and spared a glance back into the hangar. He was trapped. Vader took immediate advantage of the momentary distraction to bring his saber over and down. Kenobi somehow managed to deflect the sweeping blow, at once parrying and turning a complete circle.
You still have your skill, but your power fades. Prepare to meet the Force, Obi-Wan.
Kenobi turned a pitying gaze on Vader.
This is a fight you cannot win, Darth. If my blade finds its mark, you will cease to exist. But if you cut me down, I will only become more powerful.
Your philosophies no longer confuse me, old man.
Vader growled contemptuously. He lunged forward, feinted, and then slashing in a deadly downward arc with the saber. It struck home, cutting the old man cleanly in half. There was a brief flash, as Kenobi's cloak flooded to the deck in 2 neat sections. But Ben Kenobi was not in it. Vader poked at the empty cloak sections. There was no sign of the old man. He had vanished as though he had never existed. Once the guards had turned and dashed for the far tunnel, Solo and the others started for the starship, until Luke saw Kenobi cut in 2. Instantly, he shifted direction and was moving toward the guards. "Ben!" he screamed, firing wildly toward the troops. One of the energy bolts struck the safety release on the tunnel blast door. The emergency hold broken, the heavy door fairly exploded downward. Both the guards and Vader leaped clear, the guards into the bay, and Vader backward to the opposite side of the door. Solo paused as he saw Luke running toward the guards. "It's too late," Leia yelled at him. "It's over." "No!" Luke half shouted, half sobbed. A familiar voice rang in his ears. Ben's voice.
"Luke, listen."
Bewildered, Luke turned to hunt for the source of that admonition. He only saw Leia beckoning to him as she followed R2 and 3PO up the ramp. "Come on, there's no time." Hesitating, his mind still on that imagined voice, Luke whirled and retreated into the freighter. Inside, Chewbacca and Solo adjusted controls. "I hope that old man managed to knock out that tractor beam," the Corellian was saying, "or this is going to be a very short ride." Solo shifted a lever. The massive bay door was constructed to respond to the approach of any vessel. The safety feature now served to facilitate their escape, as the freighter slipped quickly past the still opening door and out into free space. "Nothing," Solo sighed. "Not so much as an erg of come hither. He did it all right." Chewbacca rumbled something, and the pilot's attention shifted to another series of gauges. Whirling, Solo ran out of the cockpit. "Come with me, kid," he shouted at Luke as he entered the hold. "We're not out of this yet." Luke joined Solo. He found himself in a large, rotating bubble protruding from the side of the ship. A long, wicked-looking tube projected from the apex of the transparent hemisphere. Luke settled himself into the seat and commenced a rapid study of the controls. Activator here, firing grip here. He had fired such weapons 1,000 times before, in his dreams. Forward, Chewbacca and Leia were searching the speckled pit outside for the attacking fighters represented by fire pricks on several screens. Chewbacca suddenly growled throatily and pulled back on several controls as Leia let out a yelp. "Here they come!" The Starfield wheeled around Luke as an Imperial TIE fighter raced toward him and then swung overhead to vanish into the distance. Its pilot frowned as the supposedly battered freighter darted out of range. Adjusting his own controls, he swung up and over in a high arc intended to take him on a fresh intercept course with the escaping ship. 2 fighters dove simultaneously on the twisting, spiraling freighter, trying to line their weapons on the unexpectedly flexible craft. Solo fired at the descending globes, and Luke followed with his own weapon a second later. Both fired on the starship and then shot past. "They're coming in too fast," Luke yelled. Another enemy bolt struck the freighter and was barely shunted aside by its deflector. Then a fighter loaded down on the freighter right into Luke's sights. He fired at it. The incredibly agile little vessel darted out of his range, but as it passed beneath them, Solo picked it up instantly and commenced a steady following fire. Without warning, the fighter erupted in an incredible flash of multicolored light. Solo whirled and gave Luke a victory wave, which the younger man gleefully returned. Then they turned back to their weapons as yet another fighter stormed over the freighter's hull, fired at its transmitter dish. Luke tried to relax, to become a part of the weapon. Almost without being aware of it, he was firing at a retreating Imperial. When he blinked, it was to see the flaming fragments of the enemy craft forming a perfect ball of light outside the turret. In the cockpit, Leia searched the sky for additional ships. She directed her voice toward an open mic. "There are still 2 more of them out there. Looks like we've lost the lateral monitors and the starboard reflector shield.
Don't worry, Solo told her. She'll hold together.
He gave the walls a pleading stare.
You hear me, ship? Hold together.
A TIE fighter materialized out of nowhere, energy bolts reaching out from it toward him. Its companion craft came up on the freighter's other side, and Luke found himself firing steadily at it, ignoring the immensely powerful energy it threw at him. At the last possible instant, he swung the weapon's nozzle minutely, his finger tightening on the fire control. The Imperial fighter turned into a cloud of phosphorescing dust. The other fighter considered the shrunken odds, turned, and retreated at top speed. "We've made it," Leia shouted, turning to give the startled Wookiee an unexpected hug. He growled at her very softly. Vader strode into the control room where Governor Tarkin stood staring at a huge screen.
"Are they away?"
the Dark Lord demanded. "They've just completed the jump to hyperspace," Tarkin said. "I'm taking an awful chance, Vader. This had better work." Vader exuded confidence.
"There is nothing to fear. This will be a day long remembered. It has seen the end of the Jedi. Soon, it will see the end of the rebellion."
Yavin was not a habitable world. Several of the giant planet's numerous moons, however, could support humanoid life. Particularly inviting was satellite number 4. It shone like an emerald in Yavin's necklace of moons, rich with plant and animal life. But it was not listed among those worlds supporting human settlement. Yavin was located too far from the settled regions of the galaxy. Perhaps the latter reason had been responsible for whatever race had once risen from Satellite 4's jungles, only to disappear quietly long before the first human explorer set foot on the tiny world. All that remained were the mounds and foliage-clad clumps formed by jungle-covered temples. But though the inhabitants had sunk back into the dust, their artifacts continued to serve an important purpose. A land speeder came to a gradual stop within the temple, whose first level was the uppermost of those ship-filled hangars. A noisy cluster of humans waiting nearby ceased their conversation and rushed toward the craft. Fortunately, Leia quickly emerged from the speeder, or the man who reached it first might have pulled her bodily from it, so great was his delight at the sight of her. "You're safe. We'd feared you'd been killed. When we heard about Alderaan, we were afraid that you were lost along with the rest of the population." "We don't have time for sorrows, Commander," Leia said briskly. "The battle station has surely tracked us here." Solo started to protest, but she shut him up with a stern look. "That's the only explanation for the ease of our escape. They sent only 4 TIE fighters after us. They could as easily have launched 100. Then Leia gestured at R2-D2. "You must use the information locked in this R2 droid to form a plan of attack. It's our only hope. The station itself is more powerful than anyone suspected." Her voice dropped. "If the data does not yield a weakness, there will be no stopping them." The central briefing room was located deep within the bowels of the temple. The auditorium was dominated by a raised dais and huge electronic display screen at its far end. Pilots, navigators, and a sprinkling of R2 units filled the seats. Impatient and feeling very out of place, Han Solo and Chewbacca stood as far away from the stage, with its assemblage of officers and senators, as possible. Solo scanned the crowd, searching for Luke. The crazy kid had gone and joined the regular pilots. A tall, dignified gentleman moved to stand by the far side of the screen. General Dodonna adjusted the tiny mic on his chest. "The Imperial battle station is approaching from the far side of Yavin and its sun. It must be stopped before it can bring its weaponry to bear on us as it did on Alderaan." A murmur ran through the crowd at the mention of that world, so callously obliterated. "The station," Dodonna went on, "is heavily shielded and mounts more firepower than half the Imperial fleet.
but its defenses were designed to fend off large-scale assaults. A small one- or two-man fighter should be able to slip through its defensive screens. A slim, supple man rose. Dodonna acknowledged his presence. "What is it, Red Leader?" The man gestured toward the display screen. Pardon me, sir, but what good are snub fighters going to be against that?" Dodonna considered. "Well, the Empire doesn't think a one-man fighter is any threat, but an analysis of the plans provided by Princess Leia have revealed what we think is a weakness. It's a small thermal exhaust port that runs directly into the main reactor system powering the station. A direct hit would initiate a chain reaction that would destroy the station."
Mutterings of disbelief ran through the room.
"I didn't say your approach would be easy," Dodonna gestured at the screen. "You must maneuver straight in down this shaft and skim the surface to this point. The target is only 2 meters across. It will take a precise hit to reach the reactor, and only a direct hit will start the complete reaction. The port wasn't particle-shielded. However, it is completely ray-shielded. You'll have to use proton torpedoes." A few of the pilots laughed humorlessly. One of them was a teenaged fighter jockey named Wedge Antilles.
"A 2-meter target at maximum speed," Antilles snorted. "That's impossible even for the computer."
"It's not impossible," protested Luke. "I used to bullseye womp rats in my T-16 back home. They're not much bigger than 2 meters.
With all that firepower on the station directed at us, this will take a little more than barnyard marksmanship, believe me. Remember," the general went on, "you must achieve a direct hit. Yellow Squadron will cover for red on the first run. Green will cover blue on the second. Man your ships, and may the Force be with you."
Elevators hummed busily, lifting deadly shapes from buried depths to the primary temple hangar as Luke, 3PO, and R2-D2 walked toward the hangar entrance. Solo and Chewbacca were loading a pile of strongboxes onto an armed land speeder.
"You got your reward," Luke observed, indicating the boxes. "And you're leaving then." "That's right, kid. I got some old debts to pay off, and even if I didn't, I don't think I'd be fool enough to stick around here." He eyed Luke appraisingly. "You're pretty good in a scrap, kid. Why don't you come with us? I could use you."
The mercenary gleam in Solo's eyes only made Luke mad. "Why don't you look around you and see something besides yourself for a change? You know what's going to happen here, what they're up against. They could use a good pilot, but you're turning your back on them."
Solo didn't appear upset at Luke's tirade. "Attacking that battle station isn't my idea of courage. More like suicide."
"Yeah. Take care of yourself, Han," Luke said quietly. "But I guess that's what you're best at, isn't it?" He started back into the hangar depths, flanked by the 2 droids. "I only wish," Luke murmured to himself, "Ben were here." So intent was he on thoughts of Kenobi that he didn't notice the larger figure which tightly locked onto his arm. "Biggs!" Luke embraced his friend warmly.
"I don't believe it," Biggs yelled. "Luke Skywalker, how'd you get here? Are you going with us?"
Luke said, "Of course, I'll be up there with you. Listen, I got some stories to tell you."
"I've got to get aboard my own boat, Luke. Listen, you'll tell me your stories when we come back."
His old friend was moving toward a cluster of waiting fighters.
"It's going to be like old times, Luke. We're a couple of shooting stars that can't be stopped."
Luke laughed. They used to reassure themselves with that cry when they piloted starships of sandhills and dead logs years and years ago. Once more, Luke turned toward his ship, admiring its deadly lines. R2-D2 was being snuggled into the R2 socket behind the fighter cockpit. A forlorn metal figure stood below, shuffling nervously about. "Hold on tight," C-3PO was cautioning the smaller robot. "You've got to come back. If you don't come back, who am I going to have to yell at?" R2 beeped confidently down at his friend, however, as Luke mounted the cockpit entry. Luke commenced the final checkout of all instruments. Leia sat silently before the huge display screen on which Yavin and its moons were displayed. A large red dot moved steadily toward the fourth of those satellites. Dodonna and several other field commanders of the Alliance stood behind her, their eyes also intent on the screen. Tiny green flecks began to appear around the fourth moon, to coalesce into small clouds like hovering emerald gnats. "Our ships are all away," Dodonna declared. Slowly assuming attack formations, combining X and Y wing ships, the fighters began to move outward from the moon, out to meet the technologic executioner. Ahead, the Imperial station continued to grow. Surface features became visible as docking bays, broadcast antennae, and other man-made mountains and canyons. Luke flipped several switches above his head and began adjusting his computer target readout. R2-D2 re-examined the nearing station and thought untranslatable electronic thoughts. Blue Leader compared the station with the location of their proposed target area. "Red Leader," he called. "This is Blue Leader. We're in position. The exhaust shaft is farther to the north. We'll keep them busy down here." Red Leader was the physical opposite of Luke's squadron commander. He resembled the popular notion of a credit accountant, short, slim, shy of face. His skills and dedication, however, easily matched those of his counterpart and old friend. "We're starting for the target shaft now, Dutch. Stand by to take over if anything happens." "Check, Red Leader," came the other's reply. "We're going to cross their equatorial axis and try to draw their main fire. May the Force be with you." From the approaching swarm, 2 squads of fighters broke clear. The X-wing ships dove directly for the bulge of the station far below, while the Y ships curved down and northward over its surface. Within the station, alarm sirens began a mournful, clangorous wail as slow-to-react personnel realized that the impregnable fortress was actually under organized attack. Soon, a web of annihilation began to envelop the station as energy weapons ripped out at the oncoming rebel craft. "This is Blue 5, Luke announced as he nosedived his ship in a radical attempt to confuse any electronic predictors below. The gray surface of the battle station streaked past his ports. "I'm going in." "I'm right behind you, Blue 5, Biggs said. The target in Luke's sights was as stable as that of the Imperial defenders was evasive. Bolts flew from the tiny vessel's weapons. One started a huge fire on the dim surface below. Energy bolts and sun-bright beams continued to create a chromatic maze in the space above the station as the rebel fighters crisscrossed back and forth over its surface, firing at whatever looked like a decent target. 2 of the tiny craft concentrated on a power terminal. It blew up, throwing lightning-sized electric arcs from the station's innards. Inside, troopers, mechanicals, and equipment were blown in all directions by subsidiary explosions as the effects of the blast traveled back down various conduits and cables. Where the explosion had hulled the station, escaping atmosphere sucked helpless soldiers and droids out into a bottomless black tomb. Moving from position to position, a figure of dark calm amid the chaos was Darth Vader. A harried commander rushed up to him. "Lord Vader, we count at least 30 of them. They're so small the fixed guns cannot follow them accurately. They continuously evade the predictors."
"Get all TIE crews to their fighters. We'll have to go out after them and destroy them, ship by ship."
The atmosphere of the war room back in the temple was one of nervous expectancy. Blinks and buzzes from the main battle screen sounded louder. Near a far corner of the mass of flickering lights, a technician leaned a little closer to his own readouts before speaking into the pickup suspended near his mouth. "Squad leaders, attention! We've picked up a new set of signals. Enemy fighters coming your way." "Tighten it up, Blue 2. Tighten it up," Blue Leader was saying.
Watch those towers.
Heavy fire, boss, came the voice of Wedge Antilles, the young pilot Luke had encountered at the briefing. 23 degrees.
I see it. Pull in, pull in. We're picking up some interference.
I can't believe it,
Biggs was stammering.
I've never seen such firepower.
Pull in, Blue 5, pull in. Pause, then... Luke, do you read me? Luke!
I'm all right, Chief, came Luke's reply. I've got a target. I'm going to check it out.
There's too much action down there, Luke, Biggs told him. Get out. You read me, Luke? Pull out.
Luke ignored the warning as he headed the fighter straight toward the oddly shaped protuberance. His determination was rewarded when, after saturating it with fire, he saw it erupt in a spectacular ball of super hot gas.
Got it.
Within the rebel temple fortress, Leia listened intently. Why is Luke taking so many chances? She strained to see what she could only hear. She wasn't alone.
Help him, R2,
3PO was whispering to himself, and keep holding on. It was comparatively quiet near the pole of the battle station. So intense and vicious had been Blue and Green Squadron's assault on the equator that Imperial resistance had concentrated there. Red Leader surveyed the false peace with mournful satisfaction, knowing it wouldn't last for long.
Blue Leader, this is Red Leader, he announced into his mic. We're starting our attack run. The exhaust port is located and marked. No flak, no enemy fighters up here, yet. Looks like we'll get at least one smooth run at it. I copy, Red Leader, the voice of his counterpart responded. We'll try to keep them busy down here.
3 Y-wing fighters dropped out of the stars, diving toward the battle station surface. At the last possible minute, they swerved to dip into a deep, artificial canyon, one of many streaking the northern pole of the Death Star.
Red Leader addressed his squadron. This is it, boys. Switch all power to front deflector screens.
Imperial crews lining the trench rudely awoke to the fact that their section of the station was coming under attack. Soon, energy bolts were racing at the attacking ships in a steadily increasing volume. Occasionally, one would explode near an onrushing Y-wing, jostling it without real damage.
A little aggressive, aren't they?
Red 2 reported over his mic. Red Leader reacted quietly.
How many guns do you think, Red 5?
Red 5, known casually as Pops, somehow managed to make an estimate of the trench's defenses while simultaneously piloting his fighter through the growing hail of fire.
I'd say about 20 emplacements, he finally decided. There's some in the surface and some on the towers.
Red Leader acknowledged the information with a grunt as he pulled his computer targeting visor down in front of his face. Explosions continued to rock the fighter.
Switch to targeting computers, she declared.
Pops was cool and confident, but he murmured half to himself.
No doubt about it. Oh, this is going to be some trick.
Unexpectedly, all defensive fire from the surrounding emplacements ceased.
What's this?
Red 2 blurted, looking around worriedly.
They stopped. Why? I don't like it, growled Red Leader.
Pops was first to properly evaluate this aberration.
Stabilize your rear deflectors now. Watch for enemy fighters. You pinned it, Pops, Red Leader admitted. Here they come. 3 marks at 210. We're sitting ducks down here. We'll just have to ride it out, Pops told them all. We can't defend ourselves and go for the target at the same time. 38104, Darth Vader announced as he calmly adjusted his controls. The stars whipped past him. I'll take them myself. Cover me.
Red 2 was the first to die, the young pilot never knowing what hit him, never seeing his executioner. Despite his experience, Red Leader was on the verge of panic when he saw his wingman dissolve in flames. We're trapped down here. No way to maneuver. Trench walls are too close.
Stay on target, admonished an older voice. Stay on target.
Red Leader took Pops's words like tonic. Above them, Vader permitted himself a moment of undisciplined pleasure as he readjusted his targeting computer. Again, Vader touched finger to the fire control. Something screeched in Red Leader's helmet, and fire started to consume his instrumentation. "It's no good," he yelled into his pickup. "I'm hit! I'm hit!" A second Y-wing exploded in a ball of vaporized metal. This second loss proved too much even for Red 5 to take. His ship commenced rising in a slow curve out of the trench. Behind him, the lead Imperial fighter moved to follow. "Red 5 to Blue Leader," he reported. "Aborting run under heavy fire. TIE fighters dropped on us out of nowhere. Lost Tyree, lost Dutch," Pops explained. "They drop in behind you. Sorry, It was the last message from a veteran. Astern, a silent, remorseless enemy touched a deadly button. The first bolts struck Pops, and his engine blew apart. Blue Leader forced a crispness he didn't feel into his voice as he tried to shunt aside the death of his old friend. "Boys, this is Blue Leader. Rendezvous at Mark 6.1. Blue 10, Blue 12. Join with me. Blue 5, this is Blue Leader, Luke. Take Blue 2 and 3 with you. Hold up here out of their fire and wait for my signal to start your own run." "Copy, Blue Leader," Luke acknowledged. All 3 X-wings reached the surface, leveled off, then arced into the trench. His wingman dropped farther and farther behind until Blue Leader was seemingly alone in the vast gray chasm. Suddenly, intense streaks of light began to shoot close by as the trench defenses opened up. Near misses shook the attackers. "It's not going to be easy," Blue Leader declared grimly. "Stand by to close up a little when I tell you." Abruptly, the energy bolts ceased, and all was silent and dark in the trench once again. "This is it," Blue Leader announced. "Keep your eyes open for those fighters." "All short and long-range scopes are blank," Blue 10 reported tensely. "Too much interference here. Blue 5, can you see them from where you are?" Luke's attention was riveted to the surface of the station. "No sign. Wait!" 3 rapidly moving points of light caught his eye. "There they are! Coming in .35. Blue Leader's tracking scope suddenly began a steady beeping. "I'm almost in range. Target's ready. Coming up. Just hold them off me for a few seconds. Keep them busy." But Darth Vader was already setting his own fire control as he dropped like a stone toward the trench.
"Close up the formation. I'll take them myself."
Blue 12 went first. Both engines blown. A slight deviation in flight path, and his ship slammed into the trench wall. Blue 10 slowed and accelerated, bobbed drunkenly, but could do little within the confines of those metal walls. "I can't hold them long. You better fire when you can, Blue Leader. We're closing on you." The squadron commander was wholly absorbed in lining up 2 circles within his targeting visor. "We're almost home. Steady, steady." Blue 10 glanced around frantically. "They're right behind me." Blue Leader was amazed at how calm he was. "Almost there, almost there," he whispered. Then the 2 circles matched, turned red, and a steady buzzing sounded in his helmet. "Torpedoes away!" Immediately after, Blue 10 let his own missiles loose. Both fighters pulled up sharply, just clearing the end of the trench as several explosions billowed in their wake. "It's a hit! We've done it!" Blue 10 shouted hysterically. Blue Leader's reply was thick with disappointment. "No, we haven't. They didn't go in. They just exploded on the surface." Disappointment killed them, as they neglected to look behind them. 3 pursuing Imperial fighters continued up out of the fading light from the torpedo explosions. Blue 10 fell to Vader's precision fire. Then the Dark Lord changed course slightly to fall in behind the squadron commander. It was less than a minute before Blue Leader's gyrating X-wing plowed into the surface of the station. "We just lost Blue Leader," Luke said. "Close it up, Wedge." "Biggs, where are you?" "Coming in right behind you," Wedge replied soon after. "Okay, boss. We're in position." The 3 X-wings moved close together, high above the battle station's surface. Someone's voice sounded in his ears. It was a young, old voice, a familiar voice. "Trust your feelings, Luke," was all the Kenobi-like voice said. Luke tapped his helmet, unsure whether he had heard anything or not. the steely horizon of the station tilted behind him. Wedge, Biggs, we're going in. We'll go in full speed. Maybe that'll keep those fighters far enough behind us.
We'll stay far enough back to cover you, Biggs declared. At that speed, will you be able to pull out in time?
Are you kidding? It'll be just like Beggar's Canyon back home. Luke commenced his dive toward the surface. Wedge and Biggs followed just aft.
Let's go, Luke.
A voice he had heard before sounded inside his head again. Again he tapped his helmet and looked around, but there was nothing. Puzzled, Luke turned back to his controls. Energy bolts reached out for them, passing harmlessly on both sides as the surface of the battle station charged up into space. Additional tireless explosions continued to buffet the three fighters as they dropped into the trench. Biggs and Wedge dropped behind to cover for Luke as he reached to pull down the targeting visor. A peculiar hesitation swept through him. His hand was slowed as he finally pulled the device down in front of his eyes, almost as if the nerves were in conflict with one another. The energy beam stopped as if on signal. He was barreling down the trench unchallenged. "Here we go," Wedge declared as he spotted 3 Imperial fighters dropping down on them. Biggs and Wedge began crossing behind Luke, trying to draw the coming fire away from him and confuse their pursuers. One TIE fighter ignored the maneuvers, continuing to gain inexorably on the rebel ships. Luke stared into the targeting device, then reached up slowly to move it aside. For a long minute, he pondered the deactivated instrument, staring at it as if hypnotized. Then he slid it sharply back in front of his face and studied the tiny screen as it displayed the shifting relationship of the X-wing to the nearing exhaust port. "Hurry, Luke," Biggs called out as he wrenched his ship in time to narrowly avoid a powerful beam.
"They're coming in faster this time. We can't hold them much longer."
With inhuman precision, Darth Vader depressed the fire control of his fighter again. A loud, desperate shout sounded over the speakers, blending into a final, agonized scream of flesh and metal as Biggs's fighter burst into a billion glowing splinters that rained down on the bottom of the trench. Wedge heard the explosion over his speakers and hunted frantically behind him for the trailing enemy ships. "We lost Biggs!" he yelled toward his own pickup. Luke didn't reply immediately. His eyes were watering, and he angrily wiped them clear. "We're a couple of shooting stars, Biggs, and we'll never be stopped." Then his ship rocked slightly from a near miss. "Close it up, Wedge. You can't do any more good back there. R2, try to give me a little more power on our rear deflectors." The R2 unit hurried to comply as Wedge pulled up alongside Luke's ship. The trailing TIE fighters also increased their speed.
"I'm on the leader,"
Vader informed his soldiers.
"Take the other one."
Energy bolts from the pursuing Imperials began to streak close about them. Wedge was fighting with his controls when several small flashes and sparks lit his control board. One small panel exploded, leaving molten slag behind. Somehow he managed to retain control of the ship. "I've got a bad malfunction, Luke. I can't stay with you." "Okay, Wedge, get clear." Wedge mumbled a heartfelt, "Sorry," and peeled up out of the trench. All 3 TIE fighters continued to chase the remaining X-wing down the trench. It was only a matter of moments before one of them caught the bobbing fighter with a crippling burst. Except now there were only 2 Imperials pursuing. The third had become an expanding cylinder of decomposing debris, bits and pieces of which slammed into the walls of the canyon. Vader's remaining wingmen looked around in panic for the source of the attack. Only when the freighter fully eclipsed the sun forward did the new threat become visible. It was a Corellian transport, far larger than any fighter, and was diving directly at the trench. But it didn't move precisely like a freighter somehow. Whoever was piloting that vehicle must have been unconscious, or out of his mind, the wingman decided. Wildly, he adjusted controls in an attempt to avoid the anticipated collision. The freighter swept by just overhead, but in avoiding it, the wingman slid too far to one side. A small explosion followed as 2 huge fins of the paralleling TIE fighters intersected. Screaming uselessly into his pickup, the wingman fluttered toward the near trench wall. He never touched it, his ship erupting in flames before contact. To the other side, Darth Vader's fighter began spinning helplessly. Completely out of control, the tiny ship continued spinning out into the endless reaches of deep space. The supple freighter soared high above the trench, turning to run protectively above Luke.
"You're all cleared now, kid," a familiar voice informed him. "Now, blow this thing so we can all go home."
Luke looked up through the canopy and smiled, but his smile faded as he turned back to the targeting visor. There was a tickling inside his head. "Luke, trust me," the tickle requested, forming words for the third time. He stared into the targeter. The emergency exhaust port was sliding toward the firing circle. He hesitated, but only briefly this time, then shoved the targeting screen aside. Closing his eyes, and with the confidence of a blind man in familiar surroundings, Luke moved a thumb over several controls, then touched one. Soon after, a concerned voice filled the cockpit from the open speakers. "Base 1 to Blue 5. Your targeting device is switched off. What's wrong?" "Nothing," Luke murmured, barely audible. "Nothing." He blinked and cleared his eyes. Had he been asleep? Looking around, he saw that he was out of the trench and shooting back into open space. A glance outside showed the familiar shape of Han Solo's ship shadowing him. Another at the control board indicated that he had released his torpedoes, although he couldn't remember touching the firing stud. Still, he must have. The cockpit speakers were alive with excitement. "You did it! You did it!" Wedge was shouting over and over. "I think they went right in." "Good shot, kid," Solo complimented him, having to raise his voice to be heard over Chewbacca's unrestrained howling. Distant, muted rumblings shook Luke's ship, an omen of incipient success. He must have fired the torpedoes, mustn't he? Gradually, he regained his composure.
"Glad you were here to see it. Now, let's get some distance between us and that thing before it goes. I hope Wedge was right."
Several X-Wings, Y-Wings, and one battered-looking freighter accelerated away from the battle station, racing toward the distant curve of Yavin. Behind them, small flashes of fading light marked the receding station. Without warning, something appeared in the sky in place of it, which was brighter than the glowing gas giant, brighter than its far-off sun. For a few seconds, the eternal night became day. No one dared look directly at it. Not even multiple shields set on high